When Lillian Hart stepped off that stagecoach with nothing but a battered suitcase and the clothes on her back, the good people of Copper Ridge had already decided her fate. A widow alone was either desperate or dangerous, maybe both. They didn't know she'd buried a husband who drank himself to death, lost a farm to his debts, and walked away from her own family's judgment with her head held high. They didn't know that the woman they whispered about had already survived worse than anything this rough frontier town could throw at her. And they certainly didn't know she was about to change everything. If you're watching from somewhere in this big world, drop a comment with your city below. I want to see just how far Lillian's story travels. And if you believe in second chances and love that's earned, not given, hit that like button and stay with us until the end. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in a cloud of Wyoming dust, and Lillian Hart tasted grit between her teeth before her boots even touched the ground. She'd grown accustomed to the taste of dirt these past few months. It seemed to follow her everywhere since Thomas died. Dirt on his grave, dirt on the farmhouse floor when the bankmen came, dirt on the road out of Missouri when her own sister closed the door in her face. "Copper Ridge," the driver announced, his voice rough as sandpaper. "End of the line, ma'am." Lillian gathered her skirts and climbed down without waiting for assistance. Her suitcase hit the boardwalk with a solid thud, everything she owned in the world, and it barely made a sound. The July sun beat down merciless and bright, turning Main Street into a shimmering ribbon of heat and hard-packed earth. She stood there a moment, letting her eyes adjust, letting the town take its measure of her just as she took hers of it. Copper Ridge wasn't much. A general store, a saloon, a church with peeling white paint, a handful of other buildings squatting low against the endless prairie sky. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business by sundown, and strangers were examined like specimens under glass. Already she felt the weight of eyes. A woman in a faded calico dress paused mid-sweep outside the general store, broom frozen in her hands. Two men sitting outside the saloon stopped their conversation, hats tilted back to get a better look. An older gentleman in a banker's suit emerged from the land office, his gaze sharp and assessing. Lillian lifted her chin. Let them look. She'd been looked at before, by creditors, by neighbors, by her own blood. She was still standing. "Mrs. Hart?" The voice came from behind her, and Lillian turned to find a slight man in his 50s, dust coating his worn boots and the brim of his hat. His face was weather-beaten but kind, creased with the sort of lines that came from squinting into too many sunrises. "I'm Frank Morrison," he said, touching his hat brim. "Foreman at Iron Hollow Ranch. Mr. Reed sent me to fetch you." "I appreciate it, Mr. Morrison." Lillian extended her hand, and after a moment's surprise, Frank shook it. His grip was firm, respectful. "Just Frank, ma'am. We don't stand much on ceremony out at the ranch." He picked up her suitcase like it weighed nothing. "Wagon's just over here. It's about an hour's ride. Hope you don't mind the dust." "I've made my peace with dust," Lillian said. Frank's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Then you'll do just fine at Iron Hollow." As they walked toward the wagon, Lillian felt those eyes still following her. She heard the whisper of skirts, the low murmur of voices. A woman alone. A widow. No family, no connections. The words didn't need to be spoken aloud. They hung in the air thick as the heat. "Don't pay them any mind," Frank said quietly as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. "Small town, small minds. They'll find something else to gossip about come Sunday." "I'm not concerned with gossip, Frank." Lillian settled her skirts, arranging the fabric to cover her scuffed boots. "I'm concerned with work. Your advertisement said you needed a cook." "We do." Frank clicked his tongue, and the horses started forward, pulling them away from Main Street and toward the open country beyond. "Need one bad. Been making do with bachelor cooking for near about 3 months now, and the men are ready to mutiny." "What happened to your last cook?" "Mrs. Chen moved to California with her son. Good woman, fine cook, hard to replace." Frank glanced at her sideways. "Have to be honest with you, Mrs. Hart. Mr. Reed wasn't keen on hiring a woman for the position. Said it would complicate things, having a lady out at the ranch with a dozen rough men." "And yet here I am." "And yet here you are." Frank nodded. "I convinced him, told him we'd tried hiring men, and they all lasted about 2 weeks before moving on to the mines or the railroad. Told him a woman with something to prove might stay longer." Lillian looked out at the rolling prairie, the endless grass bending beneath the wind. "I'm not here to prove anything, Frank. I'm here to work and earn my keep, that's all. That'll be enough. Frank was quiet for a moment, then added, Mr. Reed's a good man, fair, but he's been through some hard times. Lost his wife 4 years back, lost most of his savings to a bad cattle deal 2 years after that. Ranch has been barely holding on. He's not the warmest fellow you'll ever meet. I'm not looking for warmth, Lillian said. I'm looking for honest work and a place to sleep that doesn't come with conditions. Frank's jaw tightened. You'll get that at Iron Hollow. Mr. Reed may be cold, but he's never been cruel. And he don't abide cruelty in others, neither. They rode in comfortable silence after that, the wagon creaking over the rough track, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the western mountains. The land here was different from Missouri. Bigger, somehow, emptier, full of a wild loneliness that Lillian found oddly comforting. Nobody here knew Thomas. Nobody here knew what she'd endured, the whispers that followed her after the funeral, the way her own family had looked at her like she was damaged goods. Here, she could just be Lillian, a woman who could cook and keep house and earn her own way, if they'd let her. Iron Hollow Ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun painted the sky in shades of copper and gold. It sat in a valley where Willow Creek cut through the grassland, cottonwood trees marking its path like sentinels. The ranch house was simple, rough-hewn logs weathered silver gray, a stone chimney rising from one end, a porch that wrapped around the front, outbuildings scattered around it, a barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, corrals and pens. It looked worn but solid, tired but standing. Like me, Lillian thought. As the wagon rattled into the yard, men emerged from the barn and the bunkhouse, drawn by the sound of arrival. They were exactly what Lillian expected, weathered, rough-handed, curious. A dozen pairs of eyes fixed on her as Frank brought the wagon to a stop. "Evening, boys," Frank called out. "This is Mrs. Hart, our new cook. I expect you'll treat her with respect, or you'll answer to me. And to Mr. Reed." "Ma'am," a young man with red hair and a sunburned face touched his hat. "Name's Tommy Bridges. We're mighty glad you're here." "Mighty glad," another agreed, and there was genuine relief in his voice. Before Lillian could respond, the door to the ranch house opened, and a man stepped out onto the porch. Caleb Reed. Lillian knew it was him before Frank said a word. He had the bearing of someone who carried weight. Not just the physical kind, though he was tall and broad-shouldered, but the invisible weight of responsibility and loss. His hair was dark, touched with gray at the temples, and his face was all hard angles and guarded eyes. He wore work clothes, denim trousers, a shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, boots that had seen 1,000 days of labor. He looked at Lillian the way a man might look at a horse he was considering buying, assessing, skeptical, already forming judgments. "Mr. Reed," Frank said, climbing down from the wagon. "This is Mrs. Hart." Lillian didn't wait for help. She gathered her skirts and climbed down herself, then walked forward to meet Caleb Reed's gaze directly. She was tired of men looking at her like she needed saving or managing or careful handling. "Mr. Reed." She didn't extend her hand. Something in his posture told her he wouldn't take it. "I'm here to cook, keep your kitchen, and earn my wage. Frank says you need someone reliable. I'm reliable." For a long moment, Caleb just looked at her. His eyes were gray, like storm clouds, and just as hard to read. "Kitchen's a mess," he said finally. "Mrs. Chen kept things organized, but we've let it go to hell. You'll have your work cut out for you." "I'm not afraid of work." "Wages are $30 a month, plus room and board. You'll have a room off the kitchen. You cook 3 meals a day for 12 men, sometimes more during branding or roundup. You keep the kitchen and the main house clean. Laundry's handled by Mrs. Kowalski in town. She comes once a week." "That's acceptable." "I don't allow drinking in the house. I don't allow gambling, and I don't allow—" He paused and something flickered across his face. "I run a decent operation here, Mrs. Hart. I expect everyone under my roof to conduct themselves accordingly." "I understand." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Frank says you came from Missouri, that you're widowed." "That's right." "I'm sorry for your loss." The words were automatic, empty of real feeling. Lillian had heard them 100 times, and they'd never once brought comfort. "Thank you," she said, just as automatic. "Tommy, help Mrs. Hart with her things. Frank, Show her the kitchen and the room. Caleb turned to go back inside, then paused. Supper's at 6. The men are hungry. He disappeared into the house without another word. Tommy grabbed her suitcase with an apologetic smile. Don't mind Mr. Reed, ma'am. He's not exactly friendly, but he's fair. And he don't ask anything of us he wouldn't do himself. I can work with fair, Lillian said. Frank led her through the front door into a main room that served as both parlor and office. A large fireplace dominated one wall, cold and swept clean for summer. A desk sat near the window, covered in papers and ledgers. The furniture was simple but well made. A settee, 2 chairs, a bookshelf half filled with volumes on ranching and animal husbandry. Everything was neat but joyless, like a house that had forgotten how to be a home. The kitchen was worse. Sweet mercy, Lillian murmured, stopping in the doorway. Dishes were piled in the dry sink, some crusted with food from days past. The floor hadn't been swept properly in weeks, maybe months. The big cast-iron stove was coated in grease and ash. Pots and pans hung haphazardly from hooks, and the pantry, Lillian peered inside and immediately wished she hadn't, was a disaster of spilled flour, open tins, and general chaos. Told you it was bad, Frank said, looking embarrassed. We tried to keep up with it, but you're ranchers, not housekeepers. Lillian set her jaw. I'll need hot water, soap, and clean rags. And I'll need to see what supplies you have that are still usable. I'll get you whatever you need, Frank promised. He showed her to a small room off the kitchen. Barely more than a closet, really, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a hook for hanging clothes. But it had a window that looked out toward the cottonwoods, and the bed had a real mattress, and there was a lock on the door. It was more than she'd had in months. Thank you, Frank, Lillian said quietly, for vouching for me. The foreman shifted uncomfortably. Just gave you a chance, ma'am. You'll have to prove yourself from here. I intend to. After Frank left, Lillian stood alone in that wreck of a kitchen and let herself feel the full weight of exhaustion. She'd been traveling for 5 days. She'd spent her last dollars on the stagecoach ticket. She had nowhere else to go, no one to turn to, nothing to fall back on. This had to work. So she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. For the next 4 hours, Lillian scrubbed and sorted and organized with the fierce determination of a woman who knew that failure meant the street. She heated water on the stove and washed every dish, every pot, every pan. She swept the floor until no trace of dirt remained. She scoured the stove until the cast iron gleamed. She went through the pantry, throwing out anything spoiled or suspect, making a mental list of what she'd need from town. The men came in around 5:30, drawn by curiosity and hunger. They found her standing at the stove, hair pinned back beneath a kerchief, sleeves still rolled up, stirring a pot of stew she'd managed to cobble together from salvaged supplies. Smells like heaven, Tommy breathed. Smells like real food, another man corrected. I'd forgotten what that was like. Lillian turned, wooden spoon in hand. I'll need names if I'm going to cook for you, and I'll need to know about any particular dislikes or requirements. They introduced themselves one by one. Tommy Bridges, the youngest at 19. Jack Santos, a vaquero from California with a quick smile. Henry Mueller, a German immigrant with hands like ham hocks. Old Pete, who wasn't really that old but had earned the nickname through sheer orneriness. And 8 others, all weathered and work-worn, all looking at her with a mix of hope and caution. No requirements, ma'am, Jack said. We'll eat whatever you put in front of us, and thank God for it. And Mrs. Hart, Tommy added shyly. At precisely 6 o'clock, Caleb Reed emerged from his office and took his seat at the head of the long table in the dining room. Lillian brought out the stew, simple but hearty, thick with vegetables and chunks of beef, served with the biscuits she'd managed to bake in the cleaned oven. The men ate like they were starving, which Lillian suspected they probably were. Caleb ate in silence, his expression unreadable. He didn't compliment the food, didn't criticize it either, just ate steadily, methodically, then stood and returned to his office without a word. He liked it, Frank said quietly, seeing Lillian's expression. If he hadn't, you'd know. That night, after the dishes were washed and the kitchen was clean, Lillian finally allowed herself to sit down. Her back ached, her hands were raw from scrubbing, but the kitchen was clean, the men were fed, and she had a locked door between her and the world. She'd survived the first day. Through the thin wall, she could hear the low murmur of the men's voices from the bunkhouse, the occasional burst of laughter. Normal sounds, comfortable sounds. Lillian lay down on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, letting herself feel the first flutter of something that might have been hope. Maybe here, in this hard country, she could build something new. Maybe here, she could finally rest. The next days fell into a rhythm. Lillian rose before dawn to start the stove and set coffee on to boil. By the time the men stumbled in for breakfast, usually around 5, she had flapjacks or eggs or porridge ready, hot and plentiful. They ate quickly and headed out to their work, and Lillian spent the morning cleaning, baking, preparing for the midday meal. Dinner was served at noon when the men came in from the range or the corrals, hungry and dusty. Supper came at 6 after the day's work was done. In between, Lillian washed and mended, organized the pantry, planned menus around what supplies they had. She saw Caleb mostly at mealtimes. He ate with the men, at the head of the table, but he rarely spoke. Sometimes she caught him watching her, not with the curious appreciation some of the men showed, but with that same assessing look he'd given her the first day. Like he was waiting for her to fail, or run, or prove herself unequal to the task. It set her teeth on edge, that look. But she didn't let it show. She just kept working, kept proving herself through action rather than words. On her 4th day at Iron Hollow, Lillian made a list of supplies she needed and asked Frank to take her into town. "You sure about that, ma'am?" Frank looked uncertain. "Folks were, well, they were talking after you arrived." "Let them talk," Lillian said. "I need flour and sugar and coffee, and I need to establish credit at the general store. I'm the cook at Iron Hollow Ranch, and I have a right to purchase supplies in town same as anyone." Frank sighed, but didn't argue. They took the wagon in late afternoon, and Lillian steeled herself for whatever she'd find. The general store was run by a thin, pinch-faced woman named Mrs. Pruitt and her equally thin husband. When Lillian walked through the door, Mrs. Pruitt's expression could have curdled milk. "Can I help you?" The words were polite, but the tone was not. "I'm Mrs. Hart, the new cook at Iron Hollow Ranch. I need to establish an account and purchase supplies." Lillian handed over her list. Mrs. Pruitt barely glanced at it. "We don't extend credit to just anyone, Mrs. Hart, especially not to someone with no references, no family in the area, no—" "Mr. Reed sent her," Frank said from the doorway, his voice harder than Lillian had ever heard it. "She's purchasing supplies for the ranch. You've had Iron Hollow's account for 10 years, Mrs. Pruitt. You turning away their business now?" Mrs. Pruitt's mouth puckered like she'd bitten into something sour. "Of course not. I just think it's important to know who we're dealing with." "You're dealing with Iron Hollow Ranch," Frank said flatly. "Same as always." It took nearly an hour to gather everything on Lillian's list, and the whole time she felt Mrs. Pruitt's judgment like a physical weight. When they finally loaded the supplies into the wagon and prepared to leave, Lillian overheard 2 women talking on the boardwalk. A lone woman living out there with all those men. Heard her husband drank himself to death. What kind of wife? No family would take her in. Says something, doesn't it? Lillian's hands tightened on the wagon seat, but she kept her face expressionless. Frank, however, turned and tipped his hat to the women with exaggerated courtesy. "Ladies," he said, "I'll be sure to tell Mr. Reed how welcoming Copper Ridge has been to his new employee. I'm sure he'll appreciate knowing how his business is regarded in town." The women had the grace to look embarrassed. On the ride back, Frank was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "I'm sorry, ma'am. I hoped they'd be kinder." "I've learned not to hope for kindness," Lillian said. "Just fairness. And the law of supply and demand works in my favor. Mrs. Pruitt might not like me, but she likes Iron Hollow's money just fine." Frank chuckled despite himself. "That she does." "Besides," Lillian added, watching the prairie roll by, "I've been judged by better people than Mrs. Pruitt. I'm still here." "That you are, ma'am. That you are." When they arrived back at the ranch, the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose. Lillian climbed down from the wagon and started unloading supplies, but Tommy and Jack appeared immediately to help. "We got it, Mrs. Hart," Tommy insisted. "You just tell us where you want things." As they carried sacks of flour and sugar into the kitchen, Caleb emerged from the barn, leading his horse. He watched the unloading for a moment, then walked over. "Any trouble in town?" he asked Frank. "Nothing we couldn't handle." Frank shot Lillian a glance. Mrs. Pruitt was her usual charming self. Something flickered in Caleb's eyes, anger maybe, or disgust. "She give you what you needed, Mrs. Hart?" "Eventually. If she gives you trouble again, you tell me. Iron Hollow does plenty of business in Copper Ridge. The Pruitts would do well to remember that." He turned to go, then paused. "Supper smelled good when I came in earlier." It wasn't quite a compliment, but from Caleb Reed, Lillian suspected it was close. "Thank you, Mr. Reed." He nodded once and led his horse toward the barn. That night, after the men had eaten and gone to the bunkhouse, after the kitchen was clean and the bread was set to rise for morning, Lillian stood on the back porch and looked up at the stars. They were brighter here than they'd ever been in Missouri, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. She thought about Thomas, about the farm she'd lost, about her sister's cold eyes when she'd said there was no room for Lillian in her house, no place for a widow with nothing to offer. She thought about Mrs. Pruitt's pinched face and the whispers that followed her through town. And then she thought about Tommy's grateful smile when she'd made apple pie for dessert, about Frank's quiet respect, about Caleb Reed saying her supper smelled good. 3 words that somehow felt like an achievement. "I'm still here," Lillian whispered to the stars, "and I'm not going anywhere." The door behind her opened, and Lillian turned to find Caleb standing there, looking as surprised to see her as she was to see him. "Didn't know anyone was out here," he said. "Just getting some air before bed." He nodded, started to retreat, then stopped. "Mrs. Hart, I want to be clear about something." Lillian braced herself. Here it came. The inevitable conditions, the warnings, the rules about how a woman alone should conduct herself. "You've done good work this week," Caleb said. "The kitchen hasn't been that clean since Mrs. Chen left. The men are happier. Even the coffee tastes better." He paused, his jaw working like the words were difficult. "What I'm saying is, you've earned your place here. Don't let the town make you feel otherwise." Lillian blinked, caught completely off guard. "Thank you, Mr. Reed. That means more than you know." "Call me Caleb. Mr. Reed makes me feel like my father." He looked out at the dark valley, his expression distant. "I know what it's like being judged for circumstances beyond your control. After Sarah died, after I lost that money, people talked. Said I was cursed. Said the ranch would fail and I should cut my losses and move on." His hands gripped the porch rail. "But I'm still here, still working, still holding on." "Then we have that in common," Lillian said softly. Caleb turned to look at her, really look at her, and for just a moment the walls came down. She saw the grief in his eyes, the exhaustion, the bone-deep determination to keep standing no matter how many times life knocked him down. She recognized it because she saw the same thing in her own mirror every morning. "Yes," he said finally, "I suppose we do." He went back inside then, leaving Lillian alone with the stars and the night wind and the first stirring of something she couldn't quite name, respect maybe, or the beginning of understanding. Either way, it was more than she'd had when she'd stepped off that stagecoach a week ago, more than she'd dared to hope for. And out here, in this hard country, maybe that was enough to build on. Maybe that was enough to make a life. The days turned into weeks, and Lillian settled into the rhythm of Iron Hollow, like she'd been born to it. She learned each man's preferences. Tommy liked his eggs over easy. Jack would eat anything with chili peppers. Old Pete complained about everything but secretly loved her biscuits and gravy. She learned when to have coffee ready, when to pack extra food for men working the far pastures, when to save back portions for someone coming in late. She learned the sounds of the ranch, the morning bell that woke the men, the thunder of hooves when they brought in horses, the low of cattle, the creak of windmill blades turning in the breeze. She learned to read the weather by the color of the sky, to judge the time by the angle of the sun, to know when a storm was coming by how the cottonwoods turned their leaves. And slowly, carefully, she learned Caleb Reed. He was a man of few words but many actions. He worked alongside his men, never asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. He was first up and last to bed, checking the ranch with the thoroughness of someone who knew that one missed detail could spell disaster. He was fair in his dealings, hard but never cruel, and fiercely protective of what was his, including, Lillian came to realize, the people under his care. She noticed the way he'd quietly set aside extra pay for Tommy when the boy's mother got sick, the way he'd given Henry Muller time off to bring his brother out from Germany, the way he'd dressed down a traveling salesman who'd been rude to Lillian when he'd stopped by selling cookware. "I don't allow disrespect on my land," Caleb had said, his voice cold as winter iron. "You apologize to Mrs. Hart, or you leave. Your choice." The salesman had apologized, but for all these small kindnesses, Caleb kept himself apart. He ate with the men but rarely joined their evening conversations. He was polite to Lillian but never familiar. There was a wall around him, built brick by brick from loss and betrayal and the hard lessons of survival. Lillian understood walls. She had her own. 3 weeks into her tenure at Iron Hollow, those walls were tested. Started with a horse. Lillian was in the garden. She'd started one behind the kitchen, planting late-season vegetables that might still produce before first frost, when she heard shouting from the breaking corral. She stood, wiping dirt from her hands, and saw men running toward the pen. Tommy was on the ground. Lillian dropped her trowel and ran. By the time she reached the corral, Frank and Jack had gotten between Tommy and the horse, a big sorrel gelding with wild eyes and foam on his flanks. Tommy was conscious but bleeding, his arm bent at a wrong angle, his face white with shock and pain. "Get him out of there!" Caleb's voice cracked like a whip. They dragged Tommy under the fence rails while Lillian dropped to her knees beside him. "Let me see," she said, her voice calm despite the fear pumping through her veins. Tommy's arm was broken, no question. Probably his ribs, too, from the careful way he was breathing. Blood streamed from a gash on his forehead where the horse had kicked him. "We need to get him to the house," Lillian said. "Carefully, don't jostle that arm." "I'll ride for the doctor in town." Frank was already moving. "It's an hour there and back." 2 hours is too long. Lillian was already tearing strips from her apron. "Get him inside. I'll stabilize the arm. Caleb, I need hot water and clean cloth. Jack, ride to town, but don't bring back the doctor. Bring back the whiskey from the saloon, a whole bottle." The men stared at her. "Now!" Lillian's voice cut through their shock. They moved. 20 minutes later, Tommy was laid out on the kitchen table, his broken arm splinted with kindling wood and bound tight. Lillian had cleaned and stitched the gash on his head. She'd done it before, for Thomas after his drinking falls, and her hands remembered the motions even if her heart rebelled at the memory. Tommy was conscious, lucid, and in considerable pain. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hart," he kept saying. "I'm sorry. I thought I could handle him." "Hush now. You did fine. Horse was green-broke and spooked. Happens to the best of riders." She pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. "What you need to do now is rest and heal." "Can't rest. Too much work." "The work will wait," Caleb said from the doorway. His face was like granite, but his eyes were worried. "You did good, Mrs. Hart. Real good." "I'm not finished yet." Lillian looked at Tommy. "This next part is going to hurt. A lot. But I need to set that arm properly before the doctor gets here to check my work." Tommy's eyes went wide. "You're going to—" "I am. Because if it sets wrong, you'll never have full use of it again. And I think a young man like you wants to be able to rope and ride and dance with pretty girls, doesn't he?" Despite his pain, Tommy managed a weak smile. "Yes, ma'am." "Then trust me." Lillian had never set a broken bone before, but she'd watched it done. And she'd read about it in one of the medical books Thomas had inherited from his father. And more than that, she had steady hands and Tommy's future in the balance. Jack arrived with the whiskey. Lillian made Tommy drink half the bottle, waiting until his eyes went glassy and unfocused. Then she nodded to Caleb and Frank. "Hold him. Don't let him move." She grasped Tommy's forearm, found the break point, and pulled. Tommy screamed. The bone shifted, clicked. Lillian felt it seat properly beneath her hands and immediately bound it tight, splinting it securely before Tommy's body could react. "Done?" she said, stepping back. Her hands were shaking now, but it was done. Tommy had passed out. "Is he—" Jack's voice was high with fear. "He's fine. Just fainted from the pain and the whiskey. Help me get him to his bunk. He'll need to stay off that arm for at least 6 weeks, and someone will need to check on him through the night." "I'll do it," Caleb said immediately. "Frank, Jack, get him settled. Mrs. Hart, you should sit down. You've gone pale." Lillian realized he was right. Her legs felt like water, and the room had started to tilt. Caleb's hand caught her elbow, steadying her. "Come on. Outside. You need air." He guided her to the porch and sat her down on the steps, then disappeared and came back with a dipper of water. Lillian drank it gratefully, letting the coolness settle her stomach. "I've never done that before," she admitted. "Set a bone." "You did it like you'd been doing it all your life." "I was terrified." "Couldn't tell." Caleb sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling evening air. "Where'd you learn to stitch wounds like that?" Lillian looked down at her hands. "My husband used to fall. A lot. When he was drinking." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. He made his choices." She looked at Caleb, meeting his eyes directly. "I loved him once, before the drink took him, but by the end, I was just tired of watching him destroy himself." Caleb nodded slowly. "My Sarah died of fever. One day she was fine, next day she was sick, 3 days later she was gone. I never got to say goodbye, never got to—" He stopped, jaw working. "It's different," Lillian said softly, "but maybe grief is grief, no matter how it comes." "Maybe." They sat in silence as the sun set and the stars came out. Inside they could hear the low murmur of the men's voices, Frank giving quiet orders, someone laughing nervously, with relief. "You saved his arm," Caleb said finally. "Maybe his life. That horse could have crushed his skull." "I just did what needed doing." "That's what makes you good at it." Caleb stood, offered her his hand. "Come on. Those men will want to thank you, and you should let them." Lillian took his hand, feeling the calluses, the strength, the simple human warmth of skin on skin. How long had it been since someone had touched her with kindness? Since she'd allowed herself to be touched at all? Too long. When the doctor finally arrived from town, he examined Tommy and pronounced Lillian's work better than adequate. Hell, better than some physicians I've known. Tommy's arm would heal clean, the ribs would mend, and the boy would be back in the saddle by autumn. Word spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire. The widow at Iron Hollow had saved Tommy Bridges' arm, had stitched him up and set his bone like a frontier doctor, had kept her head when the men around her had panicked. Lillian thought maybe it would change how the town looked at her. She was wrong. If anything, the whispers grew worse. A woman alone, living with men, now playing doctor. What would she do next? It wasn't proper. It wasn't decent. What kind of woman knew how to set bones and stitch flesh? What kind of past had taught her those skills? Mrs. Pruitt made her opinions known at the church social, and others echoed them. When Lillian went to town the following week, she felt the weight of judgment like a physical force. But something had changed at Iron Hollow. The men looked at her differently now, not with caution or curiosity, but with respect, with trust. Tommy called her Doc Hart and made the others laugh. Jack started bringing her wildflowers from the prairie. Old Pete stopped complaining about the food and started complimenting it instead. And Caleb started talking to her. Not much at first. Just small things, comments about the weather, observations about the cattle, questions about supplies. But gradually, as the summer days grew long and golden, he began to linger after meals, to sit on the porch in the evening where he knew she'd come for air, to ask her opinion on matters of the ranch. "What do you think about expanding the vegetable garden?" he asked one night. "Could we grow enough to sustain us through winter?" "Maybe," Lillian said. "If we put in another plot and I can get some cold frames built. I'd need help, though." "You'll have it. Whatever you need." Another night. "The men seem happier, more settled. Good food and clean quarters will do that for anyone." "It's more than that." Caleb's eyes found hers in the darkness. "It's you. You've made this place feel like more than just a work camp, like a home." Lillian's throat tightened. "Thank you. I mean it. I didn't expect, when I agreed to hire you, I didn't expect this." What did you expect? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. I expected someone desperate, someone who'd take any work, any conditions, just to survive, someone who'd be grateful enough not to make waves. And instead you got me. And instead I got you. He smiled, a real smile, rare and genuine. Someone who knows her own mind, who doesn't need grateful, who just needs fair. Is that so wrong? No. Caleb's voice was soft. No, Lillian, it's not wrong at all. It was the first time he'd used her Christian name. Lillian felt something shift inside her chest, a wall crumbling, just a little, just enough to let light through. Caleb, she said, testing his name on her tongue. Thank you for giving me this chance. You've earned it 10 times over. The moment stretched between them, full of things unspoken. Then Caleb stood, touched his hat brim like a gentleman, and went inside. Lillian sat alone under the stars, her heart beating harder than it should, and wondered what she was doing. She was falling for Caleb Reed. It was foolish, dangerous. She'd promised herself never again. Never again would she depend on a man. Never again would she let her heart overrule her head. Never again would she risk the devastation of loss. But Caleb wasn't Thomas. Caleb was steady where Thomas had been reckless, honest where Thomas had been deceptive, present where Thomas had been perpetually absent. And Lillian was tired of being alone. But she was also scared, terrified, actually. Because what if she was wrong? What if the town was right, and she was just a desperate widow grasping at any lifeline? What if Caleb was just being kind, and she was reading romance into simple respect? What if? Lillian went to bed that night with her mind spinning, her heart conflicted, and her future more uncertain than it had been since she'd stepped off that stagecoach. But in the morning, there was work to do. There was always work to do. And that, at least, was something she could count on. Summer deepened into August, and with it came the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and the grass crackle underfoot. The men worked longer hours, bringing in hay before the autumn rains could ruin it, and Lillian adapted her cooking to match their needs. Cold well water in ceramic jugs, hearty meals that would sustain them through back-breaking labor, extra portions for men who burned through calories like wildfire. Tommy's arm was healing well, though he chafed at the restrictions. Lillian caught him trying to lift a hay bale one-handed and read him the riot act right there in the barn, with half the crew listening and trying not to laugh. You want to be crippled for life, Tommy Bridges? Because that's what'll happen if you don't give those bones time to knit properly. But Mrs. Hart, I feel fine. I don't care how you feel. I care about what's healing inside that arm, and it needs another 3 weeks minimum. You can help with light work, mending tack, sorting supplies, keeping me company in the kitchen, but no heavy lifting. Are we clear? Tommy's ears turned red. Yes, ma'am. Good. Now get yourself to the pump and wash up. I made apple cobbler, and you're getting first serving for being sensible enough to listen. Behind her, she heard Jack whisper, She's got you trained better than that sorrel gelding. Shut up, Santos. But Tommy was grinning when he said it, and so was Lillian as she walked back to the house. The truth was, she'd grown fond of these men. They were rough around the edges, certainly, and their table manners left much to be desired, but they were honest and hard-working and treated her with a respect she'd rarely known. They defended her when talk from town crept onto the ranch. They brought her things they thought might please her, a handful of wildflowers, a smooth river stone, a book one of them had mail-ordered and thought she might enjoy. They'd become something like family, and Caleb had become something else entirely. He still kept his distance in public, still maintained the careful proprieties that governed life on a ranch where one woman lived among many men. But in private, in those quiet evening moments on the porch or the early mornings when he'd come in for coffee before the others woke, he'd begun to open up. He told her about Sarah, about their plans for the ranch, about the dreams that died with her. He told her about the cattle deal that had nearly ruined him, about the loans he was still paying off, about the constant pressure of keeping Iron Hollow afloat when nature and economics seemed determined to sink it. Some days I wonder why I keep fighting, he admitted one night, his voice rough with exhaustion. It'd be easier to sell out, take what money I could get, start over somewhere else. But you won't, Lillian said. It wasn't a question. No, I won't. But Caleb looked out of the dark valley, the land he'd worked for 10 years. This place is all I have left of her, of us. Selling it would be like saying it all meant nothing. It meant everything, Lillian said softly. That's why it hurts so much to hold on. Caleb turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face in the starlight. You understand. I understand loving something so much that losing it nearly destroys you. I understand holding on because letting go feels like betrayal. Lillian folded her hands in her lap. I understand being afraid that if you stop fighting for just one moment, everything will come crashing down. Is that how it was with your husband? No. The word came out harder than she intended. With Thomas, I held on because I made vows, because I believed love could save him, because I was too stubborn to admit I'd married a man who loved whiskey more than he loved me. She paused, old pain flickering across her face. When he died, part of me was relieved, and I've hated myself for that relief every day since. Caleb reached out, hesitated, then gently covered her hand with his. The touch was warm, solid, grounding. You shouldn't hate yourself for surviving, he said, for choosing life when someone else chose death. Lillian looked down at their joined hands, feeling tears prick her eyes. How do you know what I needed to hear? Because I've spent 4 years telling myself the same thing, that it's all right to still be here, to still want things, to not feel guilty for being alive when Sarah isn't. His fingers tightened slightly. We're survivors, Lillian, both of us. Maybe that's why we understand each other. They sat like that for a long time, hands joined, hearts open in the darkness. And when Caleb finally stood to go inside, he squeezed her hand once more, a promise, a comfort, a connection neither of them could quite name but both desperately needed. After that night, something shifted between them. Nothing overt, nothing the men would notice, but Lillian felt it in the way Caleb's eyes found hers across the dinner table, in the way he'd appear in the kitchen doorway just to ask if she needed anything, in the small kindnesses that spoke louder than words ever could. He fixed the loose board on her bedroom floor without being asked. He brought her a new lamp from town when he noticed her straining her eyes over mending in the evening. He insisted she take Sunday afternoons off, even though it meant the men made do with cold suppers. You work harder than any of us, he said when she protested. You deserve rest. So do you, Lillian countered. When's the last time you took a day off? Caleb's smile was rueful. Can't remember. Then maybe we both need to learn how to rest. Maybe we do. But rest was a luxury neither of them could afford, because trouble was coming to Iron Hollow. It started with the water. One morning in mid-August, Frank came in from checking the range with a troubled expression. He found Caleb in the barn, and Lillian heard their low conversation from the kitchen window where she was kneading bread. The creek's running low, Frank was saying. Lower than it should be this time of year, even with the dry spell. How low? Low enough that the cattle are having to work for it. And the south pasture spring, it's nearly dry. Caleb's jaw tightened. That spring's never gone dry, not in 10 years. I know, something's wrong. That afternoon, Caleb and Frank rode out to investigate. They came back at dusk, and Caleb's face was like a thundercloud. Hale, he said, the name coming out like a curse. Victor Hale's damming the creek on his property, diverting the water flow to his own land. Lillian had heard the name before. Victor Hale owned the biggest spread in the county, thousands of acres running north of Iron Hollow. He was rich, powerful, and according to town gossip, ruthless in business. Can he do that? She asked. Not legally. Water rights in this territory are supposed to be shared. He can't cut off downstream ranches. But Hale's never cared much about what's legal, only what he can get away with. Caleb paced the kitchen like a caged animal. Without water, we can't keep the cattle on the south pasture. We'll have to move them, and we don't have enough grazing on the north range to sustain the whole herd through fall. What will you do? Talk to him first. Try to resolve it peaceable. But Caleb's expression said he didn't hold out much hope. If that doesn't work, I'll get the territorial magistrate involved. File a complaint. That could take months, Frank said quietly. I know. Lillian watched Caleb's face, saw the worry lines deepen around his eyes, and felt her heart clench. This ranch was everything to him. If he lost the cattle, he'd lose Iron Hollow. And if he lost Iron Hollow, she didn't let herself finish that thought. The next day, Caleb rode out to Hale's ranch. He came back 6 hours later, his face set in grim lines. He denied everything, Caleb told Frank and Lillian in the kitchen, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Said the creek's just running low from the dry weather. Said I was imagining things, practically laughed in my face. But you saw the dam, Frank said. I saw it. But Hale's got 3 men who'll swear it's been there for years, that it's legal, that I'm just looking for someone to blame for my own poor ranch management. Caleb slammed his hat down on the table. He's going to let us dry out and then offer to buy Iron Hollow for pennies on the dollar. It's the same game he's played with half a dozen other ranchers. Can you prove he's lying? Lillian asked. I can prove the dam's there, but proving it's illegal, proving it's causing our water shortage, proving Hale's behind it, that all takes evidence and witnesses and lawyers, things that cost money I don't have. Silence fell over the kitchen. Lillian could feel the weight of Caleb's despair, could see the fight draining out of him in real time. No, she said firmly. Absolutely not. Both men looked at her. I know that look, Caleb Reed. That's the look of a man giving up, and I won't stand for it. Lillian crossed her arms. You've fought too hard for this place to let Victor Hale take it without a battle. Lillian, you don't understand. I understand that men like Hale count on people like us being too tired or too scared or too poor to fight back. I understand that every time we let them win without trying, they get stronger and we get weaker. Her eyes flashed. And I understand that this ranch means everything to you, which means it's worth fighting for. Caleb stared at her, something kindling in his eyes that might have been hope. What do you suggest? I suggest we gather proof, real proof. Witnesses who aren't on Hale's payroll, documentation of the water levels before and after his dam went in, a case so solid that even the territorial magistrate can't ignore it. Lillian's mind was already working through the possibilities. And while we're building that case, we find ways to sustain the herd, dig wells if we have to, haul water, whatever it takes. Frank was nodding slowly. She's right. We can't just roll over. It'll be hard work, Caleb warned. Harder than anything we've done. When has that ever stopped us? Lillian met his eyes steadily. We're survivors, remember? Both of us. All of us. So let's survive this too. For the first time since he'd come back from Hale's ranch, Caleb smiled. It was a small smile, tired and worn, but it was real. All right, he said. We fight. The next weeks were brutal. The men dug wells and hauled water, working from before dawn until after dark. Lillian kept them fed and hydrated, stretching supplies and creativity to keep morale up when exhaustion threatened to break them. She baked bread in the cool hours before sunrise, made cold suppers that could be eaten quickly, brewed enough coffee to float a small boat. And she watched Caleb run himself ragged trying to save his ranch. He barely slept, barely ate. He worked alongside his men during the day and spent his evenings documenting water levels, writing letters to the territorial office, gathering statements from neighboring ranchers who'd also suffered under Hale's practices. The strain showed in the lines of his face, the shadows under his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to carry an impossible weight. Lillian tried to help however she could. She brought him coffee at midnight when he was still bent over his desk. She made sure he ate at least one good meal a day. She listened when he needed to talk and stayed silent when he needed quiet. One night she found him on the porch long after the men had gone to bed, his head in his hands. Caleb? He looked up and she saw the defeat in his eyes. I can't do it, Lillian. I can't save this place. Hale's got too much money, too much power. The magistrate's already sent back my complaint with a note saying he needs more evidence, more witnesses, more documentation. It'll take months to gather, and by then the herd will be decimated and the ranch will be bankrupt. Lillian sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Then we have months of work ahead of us. You don't understand, but Stop telling me I don't understand. Her voice was sharp. I understand that you're tired. I understand that this feels impossible. But I also understand that giving up means letting Hale win, and I will not watch you surrender everything you've built without using every ounce of strength we have left. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his expression cracked open. Why do you care so much? This isn't your fight. You could leave tomorrow, find work somewhere else, somewhere easier. This is my fight, Lillian interrupted. Because Iron Hollow is my home now. Because these men are my family. Because you... She stopped, her heart pounding. Because you matter to me, Caleb. More than I ever intended. More than is probably wise. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Lillian, Caleb's voice was rough. I can't ask you to tie yourself to a sinking ship. You're not asking. I'm choosing. She turned to face him fully. I spent years watching Thomas destroy himself, and I couldn't save him. But you're not Thomas. You're fighting for something real, something worth saving, and I want to help you save it. Even if we fail? Even then, because at least we'll fail together, fighting for something that matters. Caleb reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. You're the strongest person I've ever met. Then believe me when I say we're not beaten yet. He pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt like coming home. Lillian let herself lean into his strength, let herself take comfort even as she offered it, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them, two survivors holding each other up against the storm. All right, Caleb whispered against her hair. We keep fighting. Together. Together. But Victor Hale wasn't content to wait for legal proceedings. He had other weapons, and he was more than willing to use them. The rumors started in town. Lillian heard them from Mrs. Kowalski, who came to do the weekly laundry and felt obligated to pass along the gossip. They're saying terrible things, Mrs. Hart, the older woman said, her face troubled. Saying that you and Mr. Reed, that the two of you are, well, carrying on inappropriately. That it's a scandal, a woman alone living out here with all these men. Lillian's hands stilled on the dish she was washing. Who's saying this? Mrs. Pruitt mostly, but others are listening, and there's talk that someone saw Mr. Reed embracing you on the porch late at night. Mrs. Kowalski's eyes were kind, but worried. I don't believe the gossip myself, but you should know what's being said. Thank you for telling me. After Mrs. Kowalski left, Lillian stood in the kitchen and felt cold fury wash through her. She knew exactly where these rumors came from. Victor Hale was using the town's prejudices against her, turning her presence at Iron Hollow into ammunition against Caleb. When Caleb came in for dinner, she told him what she'd heard. His face went dark with anger. Hale's behind this. He's trying to undermine us any way he can. It's working, Lillian said quietly. Mrs. Kowalski said some of the townspeople are talking about bringing it up at the next town meeting. They want to censure you. Maybe even force me to leave for the sake of propriety. Like hell they will. Caleb's voice was hard as iron. This is my ranch. Who I employ and how I run it is my business, not theirs. Caleb, if the town turns against you completely, it'll make everything harder. You need suppliers. You need neighbors willing to testify about the water situation. I need you, Caleb said fiercely. I need you here, running this household, keeping these men fed and this operation running. And I'll be damned if I let Victor Hale or Mrs. Pruitt or anyone else drive you away with lies and gossip. Lillian's throat tightened. You might not have a choice. There's always a choice. He took her hands in his grip strong and sure. And I choose to fight for what's mine. This ranch, these men, you. The word hung between them, charged with meaning. Caleb, I know this isn't the time. I know we're in the middle of a crisis and everything's uncertain, but I need you to know. He took a breath, his eyes searching hers. You've become essential to me, Lillian, not just as a cook or a housekeeper, but as a partner, as someone I trust. As someone I've come to care for more than I thought I could care for anyone again. Lillian felt tears prick her eyes. I care for you too, but I won't let that caring destroy what you've built. If me staying here costs you everything, then I'll lose everything with you by my side and count it worth the price. Caleb's voice was steady, certain, but I don't think we're going to lose. I think we're going to fight, and we're going to win, and we're going to build something better than what we had before. How can you be so sure? Because I have something Victor Hale doesn't have. Caleb smiled, and it transformed his whole face. I have you, and I have good men who believe in what we're building here. And I have the truth on my side. That's got to count for something. Lillian wanted to believe him. wanted to believe that truth and determination could triumph over money and power and the weight of social judgment, but she'd been disappointed before. Still, when Caleb pulled her close again, when she felt the solid strength of him and the steady beat of his heart, she let herself hope. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time, love would be enough. The town meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday. Lillian spent the days leading up to it helping Caleb prepare his case, organizing documents, rehearsing testimony, making sure every detail was perfect. Frank and several of the other men planned to attend, ready to speak on Caleb's behalf. But on Friday night, everything changed. Lillian was in the kitchen, putting away the last of the supper dishes, when she heard shouts from outside. She ran to the window and saw an orange glow on the horizon, bright against the dark sky. Fire. She grabbed her shawl and ran outside. The men were already moving, grabbing buckets, calling to each other in controlled panic. "The barn!" someone shouted. "The barn's on fire!" Lillian's heart stopped. The barn held hay, feed, equipment, and in the attached paddock, several horses that couldn't be moved because of injury or illness. She saw Caleb running toward the blaze, saw Frank and the others forming a bucket line from the well. Without thinking, Lillian joined them, taking her place in line and passing buckets with desperate speed. The heat was intense, even from a distance. Flames licked up the side of the barn, feeding on dry wood and stored hay, crackling and roaring like a living thing. Smoke poured into the night sky, thick and choking. "The horses!" Tommy was shouting, his injured arm forgotten. "We have to get the horses!" Caleb was already moving toward the paddock, a wet cloth tied over his nose and mouth. He unlatched the gate and started driving the terrified animals out, slapping their flanks, shouting to overcome their fear. Most of them bolted to safety. But one, an old mare with a bad leg, was too frightened to move, backing herself into a corner and screaming her terror. Caleb went in after her. "No!" Lillian's scream cut through the chaos. "Caleb, no!" But he was already inside the paddock, already working his way toward the mare through smoke and flames. Part of the barn roof collapsed with a crash of timber and sparks, and Lillian's heart stopped completely. "Caleb!" She broke from the bucket line and ran toward the paddock, but Frank caught her arm. "You can't help him, Mrs. Hart. You'll just get yourself killed." "Let me go!" Lillian fought against his grip, watching the flames, watching the smoke, watching for any sign of Caleb in that hellish glow. Then she saw him, emerging from the smoke, the mare's rope in one hand, his other arm up to shield his face. He was coughing, stumbling, but he was moving, dragging the terrified horse toward safety. They made it through the gate just as another section of roof collapsed. The mare bolted free, and Caleb fell to his knees, coughing violently, his clothes singed and smoking. Lillian tore free from Frank and ran to him, dropping to the ground beside him. "You idiot!" she sobbed, her hands running over him, checking for burns, for injuries. "You absolute idiot! You could have died! Mare's worth $200, Caleb gasped between coughs. Couldn't lose her. "Hang the mare! Hang the money!" Lillian was crying now, tears streaming down her smoke-stained face. "You're worth more than all of it. Don't you understand that?" Caleb looked at her through streaming eyes, and even through the pain and exhaustion, she saw wonder in his expression. "Lillian, if you ever scare me like that again," Caleb breathed, "I swear I'll kill you myself." She pulled him into her arms, holding him tight, feeling him shake with coughs and exhaustion. "Don't you dare leave me. Don't you dare." "Not going anywhere," he managed. "Promise." Around them, the men kept fighting the fire. By the time they got it under control, the barn was a total loss. Nothing left but charred timbers and ash. But the house was safe, the other outbuildings were safe, and the horses were all accounted for. As dawn broke over Iron Hollow, painting the destruction in shades of gray and gold, Frank walked the perimeter of the burned barn and found what they'd all suspected but hoped wasn't true. "It was set," he said grimly, showing Caleb and Lillian the evidence. Oil-soaked rags, the pattern of the burn. "Someone did this on purpose." Caleb's face went hard. "Hale. Can you prove it?" "No, but I know it was him." Caleb looked at the ruins of his barn, at the ashes of hay and equipment and years of work. "He's escalating, making it clear what happens to people who stand against him." "What are you going to do?" Lillian asked quietly. Caleb turned to look at her, and she saw something new in his eyes. Not defeat, but a fierce, burning determination. I'm going to that town meeting tomorrow, he said, and I'm going to tell them exactly what Victor Hale is. I'm going to lay out the evidence, tell them about the fire, make them see the truth. They might not believe you, Frank warned. Then I'll make them believe. Because I'm done being quiet. I'm done letting Hale get away with this. Caleb's voice rang with conviction. He burned my barn. He spread lies about Lillian. He's trying to steal my water and my land, and I'm going to make sure everyone in Copper Ridge knows exactly what kind of man he is. Lillian felt her heart swell with pride and fear in equal measure. I'm going with you. Lillian, it might not be safe. I don't care. If we're doing this, we're doing it together. She lifted her chin. Besides, half those rumors are about me. I have a right to face them. Caleb studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Together, then. Together. As the sun rose higher, burning off the smoke and revealing the full extent of the damage, Lillian and Caleb stood side by side amid the ruins and made their plans. Tomorrow they would face the town, face Victor Hale, face all the judgment and prejudice and power arrayed against them. Tomorrow they would fight for Iron Hollow. And whatever happened, they would face it together. Because somewhere between that first difficult day and this moment, amid the work and worry and slowly building trust, Lillian and Caleb had become something more than employer and employee, more than allies in a common cause. They'd become partners, and partners didn't abandon each other when things got hard. They stood together, they fought together, and come what may, they would survive together, just like they always had. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that follows a storm, the sky scrubbed clean and impossibly blue. Lillian stood in her small room, fastening the buttons of her best dress, a simple gray wool she'd packed away months ago, thinking she'd have no use for it on a working ranch. Her hands trembled slightly as she pinned up her hair, and she had to stop twice to steady herself. Through the thin wall, she could hear Caleb moving in his own room, the creak of floorboards, the sound of water being poured. He'd been up since before dawn, reviewing his notes, rehearsing what he'd say. She'd heard him pacing, heard the scratch of his pen as he added one more detail, one more piece of evidence to the case he was building. A knock on her door made her turn. Come in. Caleb opened the door, and for a moment they just looked at each other. He'd put on his Sunday suit, black wool that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. His face was freshly shaved, revealing the sharp line of his jaw, and his dark hair was combed back from his forehead. But it was his eyes that caught her, gray and determined, but also afraid. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. I can face them alone. We've been through this. Lillian picked up her shawl. I'm coming. Lillian, they're going to say things, cruel things, about you, about us, about... Let them. She moved closer, looking up at him. I've been talked about before, Caleb. I survived it then, and I'll survive it now. The only thing I can't survive is standing by while you fight this battle alone. Caleb's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite the calluses. How did I get so lucky to find you? Luck had nothing to do with it. You advertised for a cook, and I answered. But Lillian smiled as she said it, letting him see the warmth in her eyes. Though I'll admit I got more than I bargained for. So did I. He hesitated, then leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead, chaste, reverent, full of unspoken feeling. Whatever happens today, I want you to know. Don't. Lillian put her fingers against his lips. Don't say goodbye. We're going to walk into that town hall, tell the truth, and walk back out together. That's all. That's simple? That's simple. But they both knew it wouldn't be. Frank was waiting with the wagon when they emerged from the house. The rest of the men had gathered in the yard, their faces grim but supportive. Tommy stepped forward, his healing arm tucked against his chest. We wanted you to know, Mr. Reed. We're all coming. Every last one of us. He looked around at the others, who nodded. You stood up for us when nobody else would. Gave us work and fair wages and a place to belong. Now it's our turn to stand up for you. Caleb's throat worked. I appreciate it, boys. More than you know. Besides, Old Pete added with a fierce grin. I want to see the look on Mrs. Pruitt's face when we tell the whole town what really happened with that barn fire. Jack Santos spun his hat in his hands. And I got a few things to say about Victor Hale's character. Things I heard when I worked for him, before I came here. You worked for Hale? Caleb looked surprised. For 3 months, 2 years back. Left because I couldn't stomach the way he treated people. Jack's face hardened. He's a bully and a cheat, and it's time somebody said so in public. Lillian felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at these rough, good men who were willing to put themselves on the line for a cause that wasn't even theirs. They could have stayed silent, kept their heads down, avoided making enemies of the most powerful man in the county, but they were choosing to stand with Caleb instead. That meant something. The ride into Copper Ridge took 45 minutes, and with every mile, Lillian felt the knot in her stomach tighten. The wagon carrying the ranch hands followed behind them, and she could hear their low conversation, their nervous laughter. They were afraid too, she realized, but they were doing it anyway. Courage, her mother had once told her, wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing what needed to be done despite the fear. By that measure, they were all courageous today. The town hall was already crowded when they arrived. It seemed like every resident of Copper Ridge had turned out, packed into the wooden building like sardines in a tin. Lillian saw Mrs. Pruitt holding court near the front, her pinched face animated as she spoke to a cluster of other women. She saw the banker, the land agent, the doctor, the minister. She saw curious faces, hostile faces, a few sympathetic ones scattered through the crowd. And at the very front, sitting in the place of honor beside the mayor, she saw Victor Hale. He was a big man, barrel-chested and heavy-jowled, with iron-gray hair and small, calculating eyes. He wore an expensive suit and a gold watch chain that caught the light, symbols of wealth and power in a town where most people counted their dollars carefully. When Caleb and Lillian entered, his eyes fixed on them with the cold assessment of a predator sizing up prey. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "If it isn't young Reed, come to beg the town for sympathy." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "I'm here to present evidence of illegal activity and request the town's support in seeking justice." "Evidence?" Hale laughed, a booming sound without humor. "The evidence of a desperate man trying to blame his own failures on his betters." Mayor Thompson, a thin man with nervous hands, cleared his throat. Now, let's maintain order. Let's maintain. This is an official town meeting, and everyone deserves to be heard." He gestured to the benches. "Mr. Reed, Mrs. Hart, please take a seat. We'll hear your testimony in due course." They sat, and Lillian felt every eye in the room on her. She kept her back straight, her chin up, refusing to show the fear churning in her gut. Caleb's hand found hers beneath the folds of her skirt, squeezing once, a silent promise that she wasn't alone. The meeting began with routine business, a discussion about repairing the church roof, a debate about hiring a new school teacher, complaints about stray dogs. Lillian barely heard any of it. Her attention was fixed on Victor Hale, on the way he sat there with supreme confidence, like a king presiding over his subjects. Finally, Mayor Thompson called for new business, and Caleb stood. "Mr. Mayor, members of the town council, neighbors." His voice was steady, carrying to every corner of the room. "I'm here today to report a crime and request your assistance in seeking justice." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Pruitt's face pursed with disapproval. "Go on, Mr. Reed," the mayor said. 6 weeks ago, the creek that runs through my property and provides water for Iron Hollow Ranch began running unusually low. Investigation revealed that Victor Hale had constructed a dam on his property, illegally diverting water that should flow downstream to my ranch and others. Caleb pulled out his documentation, maps, water level measurements, statements from neighboring ranchers. "I have evidence here that shows—" "Lies," Hale interrupted, his voice loud and dismissive. "The creek is low because of drought, nothing more. Any fool can see that." "If you'd let me finish, I've heard enough. You're a failed rancher looking for someone to blame, Reed. The fact is, you've mismanaged your property, made poor business decisions, and now you're trying to drag down your betters to excuse your own incompetence." Caleb's face flushed with anger, but he kept his voice controlled. "I have witnesses who saw your men building that dam. I have measurements that show the water level dropped immediately after its construction." I have statements from 3 other ranchers who've experienced the same problem. Statements from men who are probably just as desperate and incompetent as you are. Hale stood, his bulk dominating the front of the room. The truth is, Reed, you're a small-time rancher who borrowed more than he could repay, married above his station, and then lost everything when his wife had the good sense to die rather than watch him fail. Gasps echoed through the room. Lillian felt Caleb go rigid beside her, felt the rage rolling off him in waves. "That's a lie," Caleb said, his voice deadly quiet. "And you know it." "Do I? Because from where I sit, you're a man who can't even run his ranch properly without hiring a woman of questionable reputation to keep house for you." Hale's eyes slid to Lillian, cold and contemptuous. "Tell me, Reed, does Mrs. Hart provide other services beyond cooking? Is that why you're so desperate to keep her around despite the scandal?" The room erupted. Women gasped, men shouted, and Lillian felt her face burn with humiliation and rage. But before Caleb could respond, before he could launch himself at Hale the way she could see he wanted to, she stood. "How dare you," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "How dare you impugn my character or Mr. Reed's when you're the one who's broken the law, when you're the one who's trying to steal land and water that don't belong to you?" "Mrs. Hart," Mayor Thompson said nervously, "perhaps it would be better if I what? Stayed silent while this man destroys my reputation?" Lillian's eyes blazed. "I came to Copper Ridge with nothing but my dignity and my willingness to work. I've earned my place at Iron Hollow through honest labor, and I will not stand here and be accused of immorality by a man who burns down barns to intimidate his neighbors." The room went dead silent. "That's a serious accusation," the mayor said quietly. "It's the truth." Frank stood, moving to stand beside Caleb. "I examined the burn pattern myself. That fire was set deliberately, using oil-soaked rags. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't careless. Someone wanted to destroy that barn and everything in it." "And you think it was me?" Hale's laugh was sharp. "On what evidence? The paranoid imaginings of a foreman loyal to his employer?" "On the evidence of your character," Jack Santos said, standing as well. "I worked for you, Mr. Hale. I saw how you treated your men, how you drove off anyone who questioned you, how you bragged about running small ranchers out of business so you could buy their land cheap." "Lies," Hale spat. "Lies from a disgruntled former employee." "I heard you too," another voice called from the back. An older man stood, someone Lillian didn't recognize. "I'm Martin Fletcher. I owned the ranch south of yours until 3 years ago, when you dammed up my water just like you've done to Reed. When I complained, my barn mysteriously caught fire. When I still wouldn't sell, my cattle started disappearing. I eventually sold out for a fraction of what my land was worth, and I've regretted it every day since." More voices joined in, other former ranchers, other victims of Hale's ruthless business practices. The stories poured out, one after another, painting a picture of systematic intimidation and illegal tactics that had enriched Hale while destroying his neighbors. Hale's face grew redder with each testimony, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "This is outrageous. These people are conspiring against me, telling lies to..." "To what?" Caleb's voice rang out. "To what purpose, Hale? We gain nothing by lying. But you gain everything by keeping us silent. You gain our land, our water, our livelihoods. You've built your empire on the backs of good people you've driven into ruin, and you've done it knowing the law was too slow and too expensive for most of us to fight back." "The law will determine the truth," Mayor Thompson said, his voice shaking slightly. "These are serious allegations, Mr. Hale. Very serious." "Then investigate them," Caleb said. "Send someone to examine the dam, to measure the water flow, to verify my claims. Send the territorial marshal to investigate the fire. Let the evidence speak for itself." "And in the meantime," Hale said coldly, "you expect this town to take the word of a desperate rancher and his whore over..." He didn't get to finish. Caleb's fist connected with Hale's jaw with a crack that echoed through the suddenly silent room. The bigger man staggered back, shocked, and Caleb advanced on him with murder in his eyes. "You can question my business practices," Caleb said, his voice like gravel. You can question my management of the ranch. You can even question my intelligence for standing up to you. But you will not, ever, speak about Lillian Hart that way. She's worth 10 of you, and if you so much as breathe her name again, I'll break more than your jaw." Hale wiped blood from his split lip, his eyes blazing with fury. "You'll regret that, Reed. I'll see you ruined for this. You and that woman both." "Try it," Caleb said flatly. "I've got nothing left to lose and everything to fight for." "That makes me dangerous, Hale. More dangerous than you've ever been, because you fight with money and intimidation. I'll fight with the truth." "The truth," Hale sneered. "The truth is that you're finished in this county. Your ranch will fail, your reputation is destroyed, and that woman you're defending will be run out of town on a rail. Mark my words." He turned and stalked out of the town hall, his expensive boots thundering on the wooden floor. The doors slammed behind him, and the room erupted into conversation. Some voices supportive, others scandalized, all of them talking at once. Mayor Thompson banged his gavel weakly. "Order! Please, order!" When the noise finally died down, he looked at Caleb with troubled eyes. "Mr. Reed, while I understand your passion, striking another citizen in a public meeting is unacceptable." "I know," Caleb said, "and I'll accept whatever consequence you deem appropriate, but I won't apologize for defending Mrs. Hart's honor." "Nor should you have to," Mrs. Kowalski said from the side of the room. Victor Hale said something that no gentleman would say and no lady should have to hear. Mr. Reed did what any decent man would do. "But the allegations," Mrs. Pruitt said shrilly, "the impropriety of a single woman living unchaperoned with all those men." "I'm a widow earning honest wages," Lillian said, finding her voice again. "I cook, I clean, I keep house. The same work thousands of women do in homes and hotels and boarding houses across this territory. The only difference is that some people in this room seem determined to see scandal where there is none." "Because it serves their purpose," Frank added. "Victor Hale wants to destroy Mr. Reed's reputation so nobody will believe the evidence against him. He's using Mrs. Hart as a weapon because he knows it'll divide this town and distract from his own crimes." "But the fire," someone called out. "Do you really think Hale would go that far?" "I know he would," Martin Fletcher said, "because he did it to me, and he'll keep doing it until someone stops him." The mayor looked overwhelmed, his thin face pale with indecision. This is beyond my authority to adjudicate. We'll need to bring in the territorial marshal, conduct a proper investigation, which could take months," Caleb said. "Months during which my ranch continues to suffer, my cattle die from lack of water, and Hale continues to operate with impunity." "What would you have us do, Mr. Reed?" Caleb took a deep breath. "I want a citizens' committee formed to document the evidence. I want neighbors to testify about the water levels in their own creeks and streams. I want an official complaint filed with the territorial office, signed by multiple witnesses. And I want this town to stand together against the kind of corruption and intimidation that Victor Hale represents." "That's asking a lot," the mayor said quietly. "Hale is powerful. He has connections, resources, and we have the truth," Lillian said. "We have testimony from multiple witnesses. We have physical evidence. We have the courage to stand up and say that what's happening is wrong." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of her neighbors. "I know I'm an outsider here. I know some of you disapprove of me, of my situation, but this isn't about me. It's about whether this community is willing to let a bully destroy good people just because he has more money and power. It's about what kind of town you want Copper Ridge to be." Silence fell. People looked at each other, at their hands, at the floor. Lillian could see the fear in their faces, the hesitation. Taking on Victor Hale meant making an enemy of the richest, most powerful man in the county. It meant potential retribution, economic pressure, social consequences. It was asking a lot. Then a hand went up in the back of the room. It was the doctor, a graying man named Harrison, who'd examined Tommy after his accident. "I'll serve on the committee," he said, "and I'll testify that Mrs. Hart's medical treatment of young Tommy Bridges was as competent as any I've seen. That speaks to her character and her competence, regardless of what gossips may say." Another hand went up, the minister, Reverend Collins. "I'll add my voice as well. I've seen nothing from Mr. Reed or Mrs. Hart that suggests impropriety, only hard work and honest dealings. If we're to judge people, let's judge them by their actions, not by rumors and innuendo. More hands slowly rose. The blacksmith, the owner of the feed store, several ranchers, even, to Lillian's shock, the banker. Hale's been pressuring me to call in Reed's loans, the banker admitted. Told me if I didn't, he'd move his considerable accounts to the bank in Laramie. I've been wrestling with my conscience about it for weeks. But I won't be bullied into destroying a good man's livelihood. I'll testify about the pressure tactics, and I'll extend Mr. Reed's loan terms to give him time to recover. Caleb looked stunned. Mr. Patterson, Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is going to get ugly before it gets better. Hale doesn't lose gracefully. The banker's expression was grim. But some things are more important than money, like being able to look yourself in the mirror. Mrs. Pruitt stood abruptly. This is madness. You're all risking Hale's wrath for a man who can't even manage his own affairs properly. And for what? To defend the reputation of a woman who has done nothing wrong, Mrs. Kowalski interrupted firmly. I've been doing laundry at Iron Hollow for 2 months, Mrs. Pruitt. I've seen how that household runs. It's decent, orderly, and proper. More proper than some homes I could name, where the master of the house does his drinking in town instead of at his own table. Mrs. Pruitt's face flushed scarlet. Her husband was known to spend his evenings at the saloon, a fact everyone knew but nobody mentioned. Well, she said stiffly, I can see this town has lost its moral compass. I wash my hands of the whole affair. She gathered her skirts and marched out, followed by 2 other women. But most people stayed, and most hands remained raised. Mayor Thompson looked around the room, seeming to gather his courage. Very well, I'll appoint a committee to gather evidence and prepare testimony for the territorial marshal. Dr. Harrison, Reverend Collins, Mr. Patterson, will you serve? They nodded. And I'll ride to Laramie myself to file the complaint and request a marshal's investigation. The mayor straightened his shoulders. It's time Copper Ridge stood for something besides whoever has the most money. Caleb's hand found Lillian's again, squeezing tight. She squeezed back, feeling tears of relief and gratitude prick her eyes. They'd done it. Not perfectly, not without cost, but they'd done it. They'd stood up, told the truth, and found allies willing to stand with them. It was more than she'd dared hope for. The meeting broke up slowly, people clustering in small groups to talk in hushed voices. Several ranchers approached Caleb to offer their support, to share their own stories of Hale's tactics, to promise testimony. Dr. Harrison pulled Lillian aside to tell her she'd done well, that she'd shown courage. Mrs. Kowalski hugged her outright, whispering that she was proud of her. But through it all, Lillian felt the absence of those who'd left, Mrs. Pruitt and her followers, the ones who'd chosen judgment over justice, reputation over truth. The town was divided now, and that division would have consequences. On the ride back to Iron Hollow, with the wagon full of ranch hands singing drinking songs behind them and the sun starting its descent toward the western mountains, Caleb finally spoke. I hit him, he said, sounding almost surprised at himself. I actually hit Victor Hale in front of the whole town. You did, Lillian confirmed. My hand hurts. I imagine his jaw hurts worse. Caleb laughed, a real laugh that shook his whole body. God, Lillian, did you see his face? I don't think anyone's ever stood up to him like that before. Probably not. Men like Hale are used to getting their way through intimidation. Lillian looked at him, at the fading bruise on his knuckles, at the fierce satisfaction in his eyes. But you weren't intimidated. Because I had you beside me. He turned to look at her fully, the reins loose in his other hand. When he said those things about you, when he tried to destroy your reputation to hurt me, I couldn't let him. I wouldn't. I know. You're not angry that I lost my temper, potentially made things worse? Caleb. Lillian laid her hand over his bruised knuckles. You defended my honor in front of the whole town. You risked everything, your reputation, your case, your standing, to stand up for me. How could I possibly be angry? Because now everyone knows, he said quietly. Everyone knows that you matter to me, more than just an employee, more than just more. Is that so terrible? It could be. If we lose, if Hale wins and I lose the ranch, lose everything, you'll be tied to my failure. Your reputation will suffer even more. Then we won't lose, Lillian said simply. We'll fight, and we'll win, and we'll build something better, together. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop right there in the middle of the track, with Iron Hollow still a mile distant and the sunset painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. He turned to her, his gray eyes intense. I love you, he said, the words coming out rough but certain. I know it's too soon. I know we've only known each other a few months. I know we're in the middle of a crisis, and this is probably the worst possible time to say it. But I love you, Lillian Hart. I love your strength and your courage and your refusal to accept less than you deserve. I love the way you care for my men, the way you've made Iron Hollow a home again, the way you stand beside me even when it would be easier to walk away. Lillian felt tears spill over, running hot down her cheeks. Caleb, you don't have to say it back. I just needed you to know. Whatever happens, whatever comes next, I needed you to know that you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope, purpose, a reason to fight for tomorrow instead of just surviving today. You idiot, Lillian said, her voice breaking on a sob. Of course I love you. I've been trying not to, trying to protect myself, trying to be sensible. But I love you, Caleb Reed. I love your honor and your determination and the way you care for your people. I love that you named an old mare's value at $200 to justify risking your life to save her. I love that you work yourself to exhaustion rather than ask your men to do something you won't. I love you, and I'm terrified, and I've never been happier in my entire life. He kissed her then, right there in the open air, with the ranch hands probably watching from the wagon behind them, and the whole prairie stretching out around them like a benediction. It was a kiss that tasted of salt from her tears, and copper from the blood on his split knuckles. A kiss that promised everything and demanded nothing. A kiss that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. We're going to make it, he whispered. Somehow, we're going to make this work. I know, Lillian whispered back, because we're not alone anymore. We have each other, and that's more than enough. Behind them, someone, probably Tommy, let out a whoop and a cheer. The other men joined in, their voices rising in celebration across the empty prairie. Caleb and Lillian laughed, breaking apart but keeping their hands joined as Caleb took up the reins again and urged the horses forward. As Iron Hollow came into view, the ranch buildings golden in the setting sun, Lillian felt something settle in her chest. This was home. This was where she belonged, and whatever storm was coming, whatever retribution Victor Hale planned, whatever battles still lay ahead, they would face it together. Two survivors standing strong, two broken people made whole by each other, two hearts finally home. The euphoria of that sunset ride home lasted exactly 2 days before Victor Hale struck back. It started with the supply deliveries. The feed store in Copper Ridge suddenly claimed they were out of stock on everything Caleb needed: grain, hay supplements, even basic tack repair materials. When Frank rode to the neighboring town of Millerville to purchase supplies there, he found that word had already spread. No one would sell to Iron Hollow Ranch on credit, and they wanted cash up front at prices 50% higher than normal. Hale's been to every supplier within 2 days' ride, Frank reported grimly. Told them anyone who does business with us will lose his patronage, and since he's their biggest customer. Caleb's jaw worked. How much cash do we have on hand? Enough for maybe 3 weeks of supplies at those inflated prices. After that, Frank didn't need to finish the sentence. Lillian listened from the kitchen doorway, her stomach sinking. 3 weeks. They had 3 weeks before the ranch would start to collapse from simple lack of supplies, regardless of what happened with the water rights or the territorial marshal's investigation. What about the cattle, she asked. Could you sell some early to raise cash? Market prices are terrible right now, Caleb said. We'd lose money on every head, and with the herd already stressed from the water shortage. They're not at good weight anyway. We'd get maybe half what they're worth. But half is better than nothing. Not if selling them now means we have nothing to build back up with when this is over. Caleb ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Lillian had come to recognize as a sign of deep frustration. Hale's trying to choke us out before the investigation even begins, and damn it, it might work. That night, Lillian lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind racing through possibilities. There had to be a way. They hadn't come this far, risked this much, only to be defeated by economics and spite. An idea began to form, risky, possibly foolish, but an idea nonetheless. The next morning, she approached Caleb before breakfast. "I need to go to town today. Alone." His eyes narrowed with concern. "Lillian, that's not safe. After what happened at the meeting, there are people who need to hear what I have to say." She kept her voice firm. "I have an idea, but I need to talk to some people first. Will you trust me?" Caleb studied her face for a long moment. "Always, but I'm sending Tommy with you, and I want him armed, non-negotiable." "All right. And Lillian," he caught her hand, "whatever you're planning, be careful. Hale's proven he's willing to destroy anyone who stands against him. I know, but I'm not going to stand against him. I'm going to stand for us." She squeezed his hand. "Trust me." "I do." Tommy hitched up the wagon, his healing arm now strong enough for light work, and they set off for Copper Ridge. The young man was quiet for most of the ride, but as they neared town, he finally spoke. "Mrs. Hart, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why are you doing all this, fighting for the ranch, putting yourself in danger, staying when you could just leave and find easier work somewhere else?" He glanced at her shyly. "I mean, I'm glad you're here, we all are, but I don't understand why." Lillian was quiet for a moment, watching the prairie grass bend beneath the wind. "Have you ever had something worth fighting for, Tommy? Something that made you feel like you mattered, like you had a purpose?" I guess working at Iron Hollow feels like that, like I'm part of something bigger than just myself." "Exactly. That's how I feel too. For the first time in years, I have a home. I have people who depend on me and respect me. I have work that matters." She paused. And I have someone who sees me for who I am, not just what I can provide or what I've lost or what society says I should be." Tommy nodded slowly. "Mr. Reed, you love him." "I do. And he loves you. Anyone can see it." Tommy smiled. "The way he looks at you sometimes, when he thinks nobody's watching, it's like you're the only light in a dark room." Lillian felt her throat tighten. "Then you understand why I have to fight. Because love isn't something that just happens to you. It's something you choose every day, and I choose to fight for the life we're building together." "Yes, ma'am," Tommy said quietly. "I understand." They reached Copper Ridge around mid-morning. Instead of heading to the general store, Lillian directed Tommy to the church. Reverend Collins was in his small office, working on Sunday's sermon, and he looked surprised when Lillian knocked on the open door. "Mrs. Hart, what can I do for you?" "I need your help, Reverend, and the help of anyone in this town who believes in doing what's right, regardless of the cost." She laid out her plan. It was simple, really. A community fund to help Iron Hollow Ranch survive until the investigation concluded. Families who believed in Caleb's cause could contribute what they could afford, and in return, they'd get shares in the ranch's future profits. It was risky for everyone involved, but it would circumvent Hale's economic blockade and show that the community stood behind them. Reverend Collins listened carefully, his lined face thoughtful. "It's a bold plan, and it requires people to put their money where their convictions are." "I know, but I've seen how this town responded at the meeting. Not everyone, but enough people to make a difference. Enough people who are tired of being bullied by Victor Hale." Lillian leaned forward. "Will you help me reach them?" The Reverend was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I'll do more than that. I'll make this Sunday's sermon about standing together in times of trial, about being our brother's keeper, and I'll be the first to contribute to your fund." Tears pricked Lillian's eyes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. This could still fail. Hale has deep pockets and deeper connections." "But we have something he doesn't have," Lillian said. "We have community. We have people who care about more than just profit." "Let's hope that's enough." From the church, Lillian went to the bank. Mr. Patterson listened to her proposal with a banker's natural skepticism, but when she'd finished, he surprised her by opening his ledger. "I can't contribute to the fund directly, bank regulations and all that, but I can spread the word to my depositors. And I can offer this. I'll waive the interest on Mr. Reed's loans for the next 6 months. That should free up some operating capital. Mr. Patterson, that's incredibly generous. It's also good business. If Hale thinks he can pressure me into foreclosing on solid customers, he's mistaken about what kind of banker I am. Patterson's expression hardened. I've watched him destroy 3 other ranches in this county. I won't be party to a 4th. By noon, Lillian had visited Dr. Harrison, Mrs. Kowalski, the blacksmith, and half a dozen other townspeople who'd spoken up at the meeting. Some pledged money, others pledged supplies or services. The blacksmith offered to do repair work at cost. Mrs. Kowalski said she'd do the ranch laundry for free until things stabilized. Dr. Harrison pledged to provide medical care to the ranch hands without charge. It wasn't enough to solve all their problems, but it was something. It was hope made tangible. As Lillian and Tommy prepared to head back to the ranch, Mrs. Pruitt emerged from the general store and blocked their path on the boardwalk. I hope you're satisfied, Mrs. Hart, she said, her voice dripping with venom. You've torn this town apart, turned neighbor against neighbor, all because you couldn't accept that some people don't belong in decent society. Lillian felt Tommy tense beside her, but she laid a gentle hand on his arm. Mrs. Pruitt, I've done nothing but cook meals and keep house at Iron Hollow Ranch. If the town is divided, it's because some people value truth and justice, while others value gossip and judgment. You're living in sin with those men. I'm living in a room with a locked door and earning honest wages for honest work. The only sin here is the one you're committing with your tongue, bearing false witness against your neighbor. Lillian's voice was steady, calm. I'm sorry you can't see that. I'm sorry you've chosen to align yourself with a man like Victor Hale, but I won't apologize for my choices or my character. I know who I am, and I know what I've done. Can you say the same? Mrs. Pruitt's face flushed scarlet. You impudent— Come on, Tommy, Lillian said quietly. We should head home. They walked past the sputtering woman and climbed into the wagon. As Tommy guided the horses out of town, he let out a low whistle. Mrs. Hart, that was something. That was exhausting, Lillian admitted, feeling the adrenaline drain out of her. I'm tired of defending myself, tired of proving my worth to people who've already decided to think the worst of me. Then stop trying to prove anything to them. Prove it to yourself instead. Tommy glanced at her with surprising wisdom for his 19 years. You know you're good and decent. Mr. Reed knows it. We all know it. Why do you need Mrs. Pruitt's approval? Lillian smiled despite herself. When did you get so wise? Probably around the time you set my broken arm and told me I'd dance with pretty girls again. Made me think about what really matters, you know? When they arrived back at Iron Hollow, Caleb met them in the yard, his face creased with worry. How did it go? Lillian climbed down from the wagon and pulled out the small notebook where she'd recorded pledges. We have commitments for supplies, services, and about $200 in cash contributions. It's not a fortune, but it should keep us going for another month at least. Caleb stared at the notebook, then at her, his eyes wide with something that might have been awe. You organized a community fund in one morning? I asked for help. People gave it. Lillian shrugged, trying to downplay the significance even as her heart swelled with pride. Turns out not everyone in Copper Ridge is on Victor Hale's side. Lillian, Caleb pulled her into his arms, right there in the yard, with Tommy grinning and the other hands watching from the barn. You're amazing. Do you know that? Absolutely amazing. I'm practical, she corrected, but she was smiling against his chest, and I refused to give up. Thank God for that. That evening, the ranch hands gathered in the bunkhouse for their usual after-dinner card game, but the mood was different. There was hope in the air, fragile but real. Lillian could hear them through the kitchen window as she cleaned up from supper. Did you hear what Mrs. Hart did in town today? That was Jack's voice. Got half the town to pledge support. She's tougher than any of us gave her credit for, old Pete added, standing up to Mrs. Pruitt like that. Wish I could have seen it. Mr. Reed's a lucky man, Tommy said quietly. She could have left a dozen times by now, but she stays and fights. Because she loves him, Henry said in his heavy German accent. Anyone can see. And he loves her. Good thing, too. They both deserve happiness. Lillian felt tears prick her eyes. These rough men who'd been strangers just months ago had become her fierce defenders, her family, her home. She finished the dishes and went outside for her usual evening air. The stars were bright overhead, the moon just past full, and the night was cool and sweet with the scent of prairie grass. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Caleb approaching. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Didn't want to. Wanted to be where you are instead." He settled onto the porch step beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I've been thinking about what you did today, how you went into town and rallied support for a cause that isn't even yours." "It is my cause," Lillian corrected gently. "Your fight is my fight, Caleb. I thought we'd established that." "We have, but I keep forgetting how much you've given up for me. For this ranch." He turned to look at her, moonlight casting shadows across his face. "You could have a safe, quiet life somewhere, a respectable position in a town where nobody knows your past. Instead, you're here, in the middle of a war with the most powerful man in the county, risking your reputation and your safety for a ranch that might still fail. It won't fail. You can't know that." "I know you," Lillian said firmly. "I know that you don't give up. I know that you'd work yourself to death before you'd surrender. And I know that we have something Victor Hale will never have. People who believe in us, who stand with us not because they're paid to, but because they choose to." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small that glinted in the moonlight. "I wanted to wait, wanted to do this properly, when things were settled and the future was certain. But I'm realizing that the future is never certain. All we have is right now, this moment." He opened his hand, revealing a simple gold ring. "It was my mother's. The only thing of value my father left me when he died. I've been carrying it around for 2 weeks now, trying to find the right time, the right words." He took a shaky breath. "Lillian Hart, will you marry me? Will you bind yourself to a stubborn rancher with more debts than assets and a talent for making powerful enemies? Will you take on this fight as your own, officially and permanently, for better or worse?" Lillian looked at the ring, at Caleb's hopeful, fearful face, at the ranch spread out behind them under the stars. She thought about Thomas, about the years she'd spent in a marriage that had slowly died from neglect and alcohol. She thought about arriving in Copper Ridge with nothing but a suitcase and her dignity. She thought about all the reasons this was impractical, imprudent, possibly even foolish. And then she thought about the way Caleb looked at her like she was the strongest person he'd ever known, about the way he'd defended her honor in front of the whole town, about the way he made her feel valued and seen and cherished for exactly who she was. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll fight beside you and build with you and love you for as long as we both live." Caleb slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that stole her breath, a kiss that promised forever and meant it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lillian laughed through her tears. "We're engaged in the middle of a crisis. That's either very romantic or very foolish." "Probably both," Caleb admitted. "But I don't care. I want everyone to know that you're mine and I'm yours. I want Hale to know that he can't drive you away by attacking me, because we're a unit now. I want the whole territory to know that Lillian Hart chose to stand with Caleb Reed, and that makes me the luckiest man alive." "We should tell the men," Lillian said, "in the morning. Tonight, I just want to sit here with my future wife and look at the stars and pretend, just for a little while, that the rest of the world doesn't exist." So they sat, hands joined, the ring warm on Lillian's finger, and let themselves have this moment of pure happiness before the storm resumed, because the storm was far from over. 2 days later, the territorial marshal arrived from Laramie, a tall, weathered man named Samuel Cross, who'd spent 30 years dealing with frontier disputes. He set up in the Copper Ridge Hotel and began interviewing witnesses, examining evidence, and taking statements from everyone involved. Caleb presented his documentation about the water rights, his measurements of the creek levels, his photographs of Hale's dam. Martin Fletcher and the other former ranchers testified about their experiences. Jack Santos described what he'd seen while working for Hale. Doctor Harrison, Reverend Collins, and a dozen others spoke to Caleb's character and Lillian's competence. Victor Hale, for his part, brought in expensive lawyers from Denver and a parade of character witnesses who swore that Caleb was an incompetent rancher looking to blame others for his own failures. He produced documents claiming the dam was legal and predated Caleb's complaints. He suggested that the barn fire was likely caused by careless smoking or faulty equipment. The investigation stretched on for 2 weeks, and the tension in Copper Ridge grew thick enough to cut with a knife. The town was clearly divided: those who supported Caleb and believed in justice, and those who feared Hale's retribution or believed his version of events. Lillian wore her engagement ring openly, and the announcement of their plans to marry sent new shockwaves through the community. Some people congratulated them. Others whispered that it proved what they'd suspected all along, that Lillian had been angling for marriage from the start, using her position to trap a desperate man. "Let them talk," Caleb said when Lillian mentioned the gossip. "We know the truth. That's what matters." But the talk wore on her nonetheless. She tried to stay focused on her work, on keeping the ranch running smoothly, while Caleb dealt with the investigation. The community fund helped. They had enough supplies to keep going, enough goodwill from supporters to balance out the hostility from Hale's allies. But the strain was showing on everyone. The men were jumpy, sleeping lightly, always watching for the next attack. Caleb barely slept at all, reviewing testimony and documents until his eyes were red with exhaustion. And Lillian found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for Hale's next move. It came on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Lillian was in the garden, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables before the first frost could claim them, when she heard hoofbeats approaching at a gallop. She stood, shading her eyes, and saw a rider coming fast from the direction of town. It was Marshall Cross. Her heart began to pound as she hurried toward the house. Caleb emerged from the barn, Frank close behind, and they met the marshal in the yard. "Mr. Reed, Mrs. Hart." Cross dismounted, his face grave. "I've completed my investigation." "And?" Caleb's voice was steady, but Lillian could see the tension in every line of his body. "And I've found sufficient evidence of illegal water diversion to file charges against Victor Hale. His dam violates territorial water rights law, and I'm ordering it dismantled immediately." Cross pulled out a sheaf of papers. "I'm also recommending that the territorial attorney investigate the barn fire and the pattern of intimidation that multiple witnesses testified to." Relief flooded through Lillian so strongly that her knees nearly buckled. They'd won. After everything, they'd actually won. "However," Cross continued, and his tone made Lillian's relief freeze solid, "I need you to understand something, Mr. Reed. Victor Hale is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully. He's already filed countersuits claiming defamation and harassment. His lawyers are some of the best money can buy, and they'll drag this through the courts for years if they can." "But we have the law on our side," Caleb said. "You do. But the law moves slowly, and Hale has resources to exploit every delay, every loophole, every technicality. This fight is far from over." Cross's eyes were sympathetic but realistic. "I've seen men like Hale before. They'd rather burn down what they can't have than let someone else claim victory." "Are you saying we're still in danger?" Lillian asked. "I'm saying you should be vigilant. Watch your property. Keep witnesses close. And don't assume that a legal victory means the war is won." Cross handed Caleb the papers. "I'll have men dismantle the dam starting tomorrow. That should restore your water flow within a few days. But after that, you're on your own until the trial." After Cross left, Caleb and Lillian stood in the yard holding the legal documents that proved their case and felt no triumph. Only a weary awareness that they'd climbed one mountain only to see another looming ahead. "We should celebrate," Frank said, trying to inject some optimism. "We won the first battle. That's worth something." "You're right," Caleb said, seeming to shake off his dark thoughts. "You're absolutely right. Tonight, we celebrate. Lillian, can you make something special for supper?" "I'll make a feast," she promised. "We've earned it." That night, the ranch house filled with laughter and music for the first time since the crisis began. Jack played a battered guitar while the men sang off-key drinking songs. Lillian served a special meal: roast beef she'd been saving, fresh bread, apple pie with the last of the preserved fruit. Tommy made a toast to Caleb and Lillian's engagement, and everyone cheered. For a few hours, they let themselves forget about Victor Hale and legal battles and uncertain futures. They were just people who'd worked hard and survived hard times, celebrating a victory and each other's company. Lillian watched Caleb laugh at one of old Pete's terrible jokes, saw him clap Jack on the shoulder and compliment his guitar playing, noticed how he made sure even the quietest ranch hands felt included in the celebration. This was the man she was going to marry. Not perfect, but good. Not wealthy, but rich in the things that mattered. Later, after the men had returned to the bunkhouse and the dishes were cleaned, Caleb found Lillian on the porch. "Thank you," he said, pulling her close. "For what?" "For believing we could win. For organizing the community fund. For standing beside me when it would have been easier to walk away." He kissed the top of her head. "For saying yes when I asked you to marry me." "I'd do it all again," Lillian said. "Every bit of it. Because you're worth fighting for, Caleb Reed. This ranch is worth fighting for. The life we're building is worth fighting for." "Even if the fight's not over?" "Especially then. Because the things worth having are always worth fighting for." They stood together in the darkness, two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built something real from nothing but determination and hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Victor Hale wouldn't surrender easily, and the legal battles ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, they had each other. They had a community that believed in them. They had proof that justice could prevail, even against money and power. And they had love. The kind of love that endured through fire and rumor and hardship, the kind that grew stronger under pressure instead of breaking. It was enough. It had to be enough, because they were survivors, both of them. And survivors didn't give up just because the road got hard. They kept walking, together. The dawn after their celebration broke clear and cold, the first real hint of autumn in the air. Lillian woke early, as always, and started the stove for coffee. Through the kitchen window, she could see Frank and two of the ranch hands already heading out to check on the dam, dismantling that Marshall Cross's men had begun the previous afternoon. The water would return. Their first victory was real, tangible. And yet Lillian couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest like a stone. She was rolling out biscuit dough when Caleb came in, his hair still damp from washing at the pump. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Morning, Mrs. Reed-to-be," he murmured. Lillian smiled despite her worry. "Morning. Coffee's ready." "You're tense." He kissed her temple. "I can feel it." Marshall Cross's warning yesterday, about Hale not accepting defeat gracefully. She turned in his arms to face him. "I can't help feeling like we're waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then we wait together, and we stay ready." Caleb's expression was serious but calm. "Frank's doubling the night watch. We're keeping the horses closer to the house. And I've asked Doc Harrison to keep an ear out in town for any rumors about what Hale might be planning." "You think he'll try something else?" "I think a man like Victor Hale doesn't lose without fighting back. The question is how and when, not if." Caleb poured himself coffee. "But we're not the same people we were when this started, Lillian. We're stronger. We have allies, and we know what we're fighting for." The men came in for breakfast in good spirits, talking excitedly about the water already beginning to flow more freely in the creek. Tommy reported that the South Pasture Spring was starting to fill again, and Henry said the cattle were already looking more settled, less stressed. "Another week, and we'll be back to normal water levels," Frank predicted. "Maybe less." It felt like things were finally turning around. Like maybe, just maybe, they'd weathered the worst of the storm. That illusion lasted until mid-afternoon when a rider came from town at full gallop. It was Reverend Collins, his normally calm face flushed with urgency. He practically fell off his horse in his haste to reach Caleb, who'd been working on the corral fence. "Mr. Reed, Caleb, you need to come to town. Now." Caleb's hand stilled on the fence rail. "What's happened?" "Hale's called a special town council meeting. He's demanding that Mrs. Hart be removed from the ranch on grounds of moral impropriety, and he's threatening to bring criminal charges if you refuse." The Reverend's words tumbled out in a rush. "He's got the territorial statute on his side, the old decency laws about unmarried women living in close quarters with unrelated men. Says it's a corruption of public morals." Lillian, who'd come out of the house when she heard the commotion, felt ice flood her veins. He can't do that. Those laws are from 30 years ago. Nobody enforces them. He can if he convinces the territorial judge that there's cause, and he's brought in witnesses who'll swear they've seen improper behavior. Reverend Collins looked stricken. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hart. He's using every weapon he has, and this is the sharpest one left. When's the meeting? Caleb's voice was deadly quiet. 7 o'clock tonight, at the town hall. The Reverend gripped his reins. Mayor Thompson sent me to warn you. He's trying to delay things, but Hale's got 3 council members in his pocket. This could go very badly. After Collins left to return to town, Caleb and Lillian stood in the yard, the weight of this new threat crushing down on them. He's going to force us to choose, Lillian said quietly. Either I leave the ranch, or you face criminal charges for harboring me. It's brilliant, really. Evil, but brilliant. You're not leaving. Caleb's jaw was set. I don't care what threats he makes. You're not leaving. Caleb, if they arrest you, they won't, because we're going to end this. Tonight, once and for all. He turned to her, his gray eyes blazing with determination. How fast can you be ready for a wedding? Lillian's breath caught. What? The law says unmarried women can't live unchaperoned with unrelated men. So let's get married, right now, today, before that meeting tonight. Caleb took her hands. I know it's not the wedding you deserve. No time to plan, no fancy dress, none of the things that should come with it. But it solves Hale's legal argument, and it makes official what we both already know, that you're my partner in every way that matters. You want to get married in the next... Lillian glanced at the sun. 4 hours? I want to marry you. The timing is just strategy. His grip tightened. But only if you want this too. Only if you're ready. I won't let Hale force you into anything, even marriage to me. Lillian looked at this man who'd given her a home, a purpose, a love she'd thought she'd never find. She thought about the careful, proper wedding she'd had with Thomas, all tradition and empty promises. She thought about what really mattered, not the ceremony, but the commitment. Not the appearance, but the reality. I'm ready, she said. I've been ready since the moment you asked me on that porch. Let's do it. Caleb's face transformed with relief and joy. You're sure? Completely. Lillian squeezed his hands. Let's get married, Caleb Reed, and then let's go to that town meeting and show Victor Hale exactly what he's up against. The next 4 hours were controlled chaos. Frank rode to fetch Reverend Collins back to perform the ceremony. Tommy and Jack raced around preparing the main room of the ranch house, sweeping and decorating with whatever they could find. Wildflowers from the prairie, lanterns to provide warm light, the good dishes from the china cabinet that hadn't been used in years. Lillian washed and put on her best dress. Still just the gray wool, but she pinned her hair up carefully and borrowed a lace handkerchief from Mrs. Kowalski's last laundry delivery. It wasn't a wedding dress, but when she looked in the small mirror in her room, she saw something better than white silk and fancy trimmings. She saw a woman who'd fought for her happiness and won it. Caleb wore his Sunday suit and looked nervous as a schoolboy, pacing the porch while the men set up inside. Henry Mueller had ridden to fetch Mrs. Kowalski and Dr. Harrison as witnesses, and they arrived breathless and delighted just as the sun was beginning its descent. "Oh, my dear girl," Mrs. Kowalski said, pulling Lillian into a fierce hug. "I'm so happy for you both." "It's rather sudden," Lillian said, feeling tears threaten. "The best things usually are." The older woman patted her cheek. "Now, let's get you married before Victor Hale can cause any more trouble." Reverend Collins arrived with his prayer book and a wide smile. "I've performed a lot of weddings in my time, but this might be the most important. Shall we begin?" They gathered in the main room, Caleb and Lillian standing before the fireplace, the Reverend between them, and everyone else crowded around. All the ranch hands had cleaned up and put on their best clothes, their weathered faces solemn and happy. Mrs. Kowalski dabbed at her eyes with her apron. Dr. Harrison stood with his hands clasped, looking like a proud father. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Collins began, and his voice filled the room with warmth and authority, "we are gathered here in the sight of these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Lillian barely heard the traditional words. Her eyes were locked on Caleb's, seeing the love and determination and promise there. This wasn't how she'd imagined getting married again, but it was perfect in its imperfection, real in its simplicity. Caleb Reed, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part? I do. Caleb's voice was strong and sure, with everything I am and everything I have. Lillian Hart, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part? I do. Lillian's voice broke with emotion, but she meant every word. For as long as we both shall live. Caleb slipped his mother's ring, which Lillian had been wearing as an engagement ring, off her finger, then placed it back on with the words, "With this ring I thee wed. All that I am I give to you, and all that I have I share with you. By the power vested in me by the Wyoming Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Reverend Collins beamed. "Caleb, you may kiss your bride." And he did, right there in front of everyone. A kiss that spoke of joy and relief and fierce determination. The ranch hands cheered, Mrs. Kowalski openly wept, and Dr. Harrison produced a bottle of champagne he'd somehow managed to bring along. For just a moment, they let themselves celebrate. Tommy played a fiddle someone had found in the bunkhouse, and Jack convinced Lillian to dance with him, spinning her around the room while Caleb laughed. Mrs. Kowalski had brought a cake, simple but sweet, and they toasted the newlyweds with champagne and well wishes. But the clock was ticking toward 7, and they all knew it. Finally, Caleb raised his hand for quiet. "Thank you, all of you, for being here, for standing with us, for making this day possible." He looked around at the assembled faces. "But we have one more battle to fight tonight, and I need you all with me one more time." "We're with you, boss," Frank said immediately, "every step of the way." "Damn right we are," Old Pete added. "Let's go show that bastard Hale what Iron Hollow's made of." They loaded into wagons, Caleb and Lillian in the lead wagon, the ranch hands following behind, Mrs. Kowalski and Dr. Harrison bringing up the rear. As they rolled toward Copper Ridge in the gathering dusk, Lillian sat close to her new husband, her hand in his. "Mrs. Reed," Caleb said softly. "How does that sound?" "Like home," Lillian answered. "Like exactly where I'm supposed to be." The town hall was packed even fuller than it had been for the first meeting. Word had spread about Hale's latest attack, and everyone had turned out to see how it would end. Lillian saw Mrs. Pruitt sitting in her usual place, looking triumphant. She saw Hale's lawyers with their expensive suits and calculating eyes. She saw the territorial judge who'd come from Laramie, an older man with a stern face and a reputation for strict interpretation of the law. And she saw her allies, Reverend Collins and the others who'd stood with them, Mayor Thompson looking nervous but determined, and ordinary townspeople who'd quietly supported their cause. Victor Hale sat at the front, and when Caleb and Lillian walked in, his face split into a predatory smile. "Well, well, Reed decided to show up after all. Did you bring Mrs. Hart to say goodbye to Copper Ridge? Because after tonight, she won't be welcome here anymore." "Actually," Caleb said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence, "I brought my wife to show you that your legal threats are worthless." The room erupted. Hale shot to his feet, his face turning purple. "Your wife? You can't possibly—" "We were married this evening by Reverend Collins, with proper witnesses and full legal documentation." Caleb pulled out the marriage certificate and handed it to Judge Morrison. "As Mrs. Reed, my wife, has every legal right to live at Iron Hollow Ranch. Your moral impropriety argument is moot." Judge Morrison examined the certificate carefully, then looked at Reverend Collins, who nodded confirmation. "This appears to be in order. The marriage is legal and binding." Hale's hands clenched into fists. "This is a sham, a desperate attempt to circumvent the law. They only got married to avoid the consequences of their immoral behavior." "We got married," Lillian said, standing up, "because we love each other and want to build a life together. The timing was accelerated by your threats, yes, but the commitment is real, and it's legal, and there's nothing you can do about it." "This isn't over," Hale snarled. I still have the defamation suit, the counterclaims about the water rights, the investigation into the fire. You think one quick wedding solves everything? No, Caleb said, but it solves your attempt to drive Lillian away. And it shows everyone in this room that we're not backing down. We're not running. We're standing here, legally married, on legally sound ground, and we're ready to fight every single one of your bogus claims in court. Those claims aren't bogus. They are, and everyone knows it. Dr. Harrison stood. I examined the fire evidence. It was arson. I heard you threaten Mr. Reed at the last meeting, and I'm prepared to testify to all of it. As am I, Reverend Collins added. Your pattern of intimidation is well documented, Mr. Hale. The more you fight, the more evidence accumulates against you. Other voices joined in. Ranchers who'd suffered under Hale's tactics, townspeople who'd witnessed his threats, even the banker who confirmed that Hale had tried to pressure him into illegal foreclosure. Hale looked around the room, and for the first time, Lillian saw something like fear flicker across his face. He was realizing that he'd pushed too hard, threatened too many people, made too many enemies. His wealth and power had always protected him before, but this time he'd gone too far. Judge Morrison banged his gavel. Mr. Hale, based on the evidence I've reviewed and the testimony I've heard, I'm recommending to the territorial attorney that all charges related to moral impropriety be dropped. Furthermore, I'm ordering you to cease all harassment of Mr. and Mrs. Reed, to comply with the water rights restoration order, and to submit to a full investigation of the fire and your business practices. You can't do this, Hale said, but his voice had lost its certainty. I have rights, I have lawyers, and they'll have their day in court. But until then, you will leave the Reeds alone. Consider that a court order, Mr. Hale. Violate it, and you'll face contempt charges on top of everything else. Hale stood there, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. He'd lost. After years of winning through intimidation and money, he'd finally lost. And everyone in the room could see it. He turned and stalked out of the town hall, his lawyers scrambling to follow. The doors slammed behind him, and the room exploded into conversation. Mayor Thompson approached Caleb and Lillian, his hand extended. Congratulations on your marriage, and I want to apologize for not standing up to Hale sooner. It took courage like yours to show the rest of us what was possible. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Caleb said, shaking his hand. But we couldn't have done it without this community's support. People crowded around them then. Congratulations on the marriage, relief that the crisis was over, promises of continued support. Mrs. Kowalski organized an impromptu reception right there in the town hall, and someone produced more champagne, and before long it felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a celebration. Even Mrs. Pruitt approached, though she looked like it pained her. I suppose I should offer my congratulations, Mrs. Reed. Thank you, Lillian said graciously. I know we've had our differences. Yes. Well, Mrs. Pruitt's mouth pursed. I may not approve of how quickly you two married, but I suppose it's legal enough. And I suppose you did save young Tommy's arm. That counts for something. It was the closest thing to an apology Lillian was likely to get, and she accepted it with a nod. The celebration went late into the evening, but finally Caleb and Lillian said their goodbyes and climbed back into the wagon for the ride home. The ranch hands had left earlier, giving them privacy, and the prairie was dark and quiet under a sky full of stars. We did it, Lillian said, leaning against her husband's shoulder. We actually did it. We did, Caleb agreed. Hale might still cause trouble with his lawsuits, but the worst is over. The town knows the truth. The law is on our side, and you're legally permanently mine. And you're mine, Lillian looked up at him. How does it feel to be married again? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Different than the first time. Better. Sarah and I loved each other, but we were young and idealistic. We thought love would be enough to overcome anything. When she died, I learned how wrong we were. And now? Now I know that love isn't enough by itself. It takes work and sacrifice and fighting for each other. It takes standing together when things get hard instead of breaking apart. He kissed the top of her head. You taught me that, Lillian. You showed me that real love isn't just feeling, it's choosing every day to stand with someone no matter what. You taught me something too, Lillian said softly. You taught me that I'm worth fighting for, that I don't have to accept less than I deserve, that I can be strong and vulnerable at the same time. She turned to look at him fully. Thomas made me feel like I had to earn love through perfection. You make me feel like I'm enough exactly as I am. You're more than enough. You're everything. They rode the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, both of them processing everything that had happened. In one day, they'd gone from threatened to married, from uncertain to victorious, from fighting separate battles to standing united as husband and wife. When Iron Hollow came into view, the ranch house glowing with lamplight from the windows, Lillian felt her heart swell with love and gratitude. This was home. This was family. This was the life she'd fought for and won. The ranch hands had left lanterns lit along the path to the house, and as Caleb helped Lillian down from the wagon, they could hear soft music coming from the bunkhouse. Tommy's fiddle, playing something sweet and slow. "They're giving us privacy," Caleb said with a smile. "Probably the first time in months we've had the house to ourselves." He swept Lillian up into his arms, and she laughed with surprise and delight as he carried her across the threshold of their home. He set her down gently in the main room, now lit by the lanterns Jack and Tommy had arranged earlier, still decorated with the wildflowers from their hasty wedding. "Mrs. Reed," Caleb said formally, offering his hand. "May I have this dance?" There was no music except the distant fiddle from the bunkhouse, but Lillian took his hand anyway. "You may, Mr. Reed." They danced slowly in the lamplight, just the two of them, holding each other close. It wasn't graceful or practiced, just two people moving together, learning each other's rhythms, building something new from the ashes of their old lives. "I never thought I'd have this again," Caleb murmured. "A wife, a partner, someone to share everything with." "Neither did I. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone, keeping house for strangers, never belonging anywhere." Lillian rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Thank you for seeing me, for valuing me, for choosing me. Always," Caleb promised, "for as long as I live." Later, much later, as they lay together in the darkness of their room, no longer separate spaces but shared as it should be, Lillian thought about the journey that had brought her here. The stagecoach arriving in Copper Ridge, the burned barn, the town meetings, the whispers and judgment, the slow building of trust, the discovery of love. Every hardship had been worth it to arrive at this moment. "Caleb," she whispered into the darkness. "What happens now, with Hale, with the ranch, with everything?" "Now we live," he said simply. "We rebuild the barn, we raise the cattle, we work the land, we love each other." He pulled her closer. "And when Hale's lawyers come calling with their lawsuits, we face them together. But we don't let that fighting define us. We define ourselves by what we build, not by what we survive." "I like that," Lillian said. "Building instead of just surviving." "So do I." The next morning, Lillian woke to find herself alone in bed. For a moment she felt panic. Had it all been a dream? But then she saw Caleb's clothes draped over the chair, saw her wedding ring glinting on her finger, and heard sounds from the kitchen. She wrapped herself in a robe and padded out to find her husband standing at the stove, attempting to make coffee. He turned when he heard her, his face lighting up. "Morning, wife. I was trying to let you sleep in. And making coffee without me? Brave man." Lillian moved to the stove and gently took over, showing him the proper amount of grounds to use. "What are you doing up so early?" "Couldn't sleep, too happy." He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "And I wanted to see the sunrise with you, our first sunrise as husband and wife." They carried their coffee out to the porch and sat on the steps, watching the sky lighten from indigo to rose to gold. The prairie stretched out before them, endless and beautiful, and Lillian felt a peace she'd never known before. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Not perfection, but belonging. Not rescue, but partnership. Not an escape from her past, but a foundation for her future. Over the next weeks, life at Iron Hollow settled into a new normal. The water returned to full flow, and the cattle recovered their health and weight. The community fund contributions allowed them to rebuild the barn, a whole town effort that brought neighbors together for a barn raising that doubled as a celebration of the Reeds' marriage. Victor Hale's lawsuits dragged on, but with each court appearance, his case grew weaker. More witnesses came forward, more evidence accumulated. His lawyers began advising him to settle rather than face a trial he'd likely lose. Meanwhile, Iron Hollow thrived. Caleb and Lillian worked side by side, making decisions together, building not just a ranch, but a real home. The men noticed the change, how the house felt warmer, how meals were shared with more laughter, how even the hardest work seemed lighter when done by people who genuinely cared for each other. Tommy's arm healed completely, and he became something of a legend in town. The young man saved by the widow-turned-rancher's wife, who had more courage and skill than most doctors. Young women started finding excuses to visit Iron Hollow, and Tommy turned bashful and tongue-tied in their presence, much to the amusement of the other hands. 6 months after their wedding, on a crisp autumn day with the cottonwoods turning gold along the creek, Lillian stood in the garden she'd expanded, harvesting vegetables for winter storage. She heard hoofbeats and looked up to see Marshall Cross riding into the yard. Her heart clenched. After months of relative peace, had something gone wrong? But Cross was smiling when he dismounted. "Mrs. Reed, is your husband around?" "In the barn. Is everything all right?" "Better than all right. I have news." They found Caleb checking on a mare about to foal, and he emerged from the stall with concern on his face that melted into hope when he saw Cross's expression. "Hale's settled," the marshal said without preamble. "Dropped all the lawsuits, agreed to pay damages for the barn fire, and signed a permanent agreement not to interfere with your water rights or operations. His lawyers finally convinced him that going to trial would destroy what's left of his reputation and possibly lead to criminal charges." Caleb stared at him. "It's over? It's really over?" "It's over. You won, Mr. Reed, completely and totally." Cross handed him the settlement papers. "Congratulations." After Cross left, Caleb and Lillian stood in the barn, holding the papers that represented their final victory, and felt the weight of months of struggle finally lift from their shoulders. "We did it," Lillian said, her voice breaking. "We actually did it." Caleb pulled her into his arms, and they held each other tight, both crying and laughing at the same time. They'd survived. They'd won. They'd built something real and lasting from nothing but determination and love. That evening, they gathered everyone, the ranch hands, their allies from town, the people who'd stood with them through the hardest times, for a celebration dinner. Lillian cooked the finest meal she'd ever made, and they filled the ranch house with music and laughter and stories. Reverend Collins offered a blessing, thanking the Almighty for seeing them through their trials and bringing them to this place of peace and prosperity. Dr. Harrison toasted their courage. Mrs. Kowalski cried happy tears and declared that she'd never seen two people more meant for each other. As the evening wore on and the lanterns glowed warm against the gathering darkness, Caleb stood and raised his glass. "I want to thank all of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When I thought I was alone, you showed me I had a community. When I thought I'd lost everything, you helped me see what I still had. And when I was ready to give up, one stubborn woman with a suitcase and more courage than sense walked into my life and changed everything." Lillian felt tears stream down her face as Caleb turned to her. "Lillian, you came to Iron Hollow looking for work and a place to sleep. But you gave me so much more. You gave me hope. You gave me love. You gave me a reason to fight for tomorrow instead of just enduring today." He raised his glass higher. "To my wife, who saved more than just a ranch. She saved me." "To Mrs. Reed," everyone chorused, raising their glasses. "To all of us," Lillian added, standing beside her husband. "Because we didn't do this alone. We did it together, as a community, as a family, and that's something worth celebrating." Later, after their guests had gone home, and the ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse, Caleb and Lillian stood on the porch where they'd shared so many conversations over the past months. The same stars that had witnessed their struggles now shone down on their triumph. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked, wrapping his arms around her. "About how far we've come. About stepping off that stagecoach with nothing but a suitcase and a prayer. About being judged and whispered about and thinking I'd never find a real home." Lillian leaned back against him. "About how grateful I am that you needed a cook." Caleb laughed. "Best hiring decision I ever made." "We should tell them," Lillian said quietly. "Tell who what?" She turned in his arms to face him, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. Tell everyone that in about 6 months, Iron Hollow is going to have one more resident. Caleb's eyes went wide. We're, really? Really? Lillian smiled through happy tears. I found out last week but wanted to wait until everything was settled before I told you. We're going to have a baby, Caleb. For a moment, Caleb just stared at her, his face cycling through shock and joy and wonder. Then he let out a whoop of pure happiness and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she was laughing and dizzy. We're having a baby, he said, setting her down gently like she was made of glass. A child. Our child. Are you happy? Happy? Lillian, He cupped her face in his hands, his eyes shining with tears. I'm beyond happy. I'm blessed. I'm grateful. I'm terrified and excited and so full of love I think my heart might burst. Good, Lillian said, kissing him softly, because this child is going to need a father who loves fiercely and protects loyally and teaches them that anything worth having is worth fighting for. They'll have that, Caleb promised, and they'll have a mother who's the strongest person I've ever known, who never gives up, never backs down, and loves with her whole heart. They stood there on the porch of Iron Hollow Ranch, two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd fought for their love and their home, and one, now looking forward to a future brighter than either had dared to imagine. Around them, the ranch settled into nighttime quiet, the cattle lowing in the distance, the creek flowing free and clear, the cottonwoods rustling in the breeze, the house that had been just a building when Lillian arrived, now truly a home filled with love and laughter and hope. She'd come to Wyoming with nothing, no family, no fortune, no future she could see. But she'd found everything that mattered: a home, a family, a purpose, a love worth fighting for. And standing there in her husband's arms, with their child growing beneath her heart and the stars shining overhead, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that every hardship, every struggle, every moment of doubt had been worth it to arrive at this perfect moment. She was home. She was loved. She was exactly where she was meant to be. And the life she and Caleb were building together on this ranch, in this hard but beautiful country, with these good people around them, would be a legacy of love and courage and determination that would last for generations. Iron Hollow Ranch had been saved. But more than that, two broken souls had found wholeness in each other. Two lonely hearts had discovered that love, real love, was worth every battle, every sacrifice, every moment of fear. Because in the end, love wasn't about perfection or ease or safety. Love was about choosing to stand together when the world tried to tear you apart. Love was about building something real from nothing but hope and determination. Love was about finding home in another person's heart. And Lillian and Caleb Reed had found all of that and more. Together, they'd built a life. Together, they'd won their battles. Together, they'd found their forever. And as the Wyoming stars shone down on Iron Hollow Ranch, bearing witness to their joy, two survivors who'd become so much more than they'd ever dreamed possible held each other close and looked toward a future bright with promise. The past was laid to rest. The present was filled with love. And the future, their future, stretched out before them like the endless prairie, full of possibility and hope, and the kind of happiness that comes from fighting for what matters and winning. They'd saved each other. They'd built a home. And now, together, they would build a family. It was more than either had dared to hope for. It was everything they needed. It was enough.